Hello there, and welcome to Secretum Histories, a quiet corner where big ancient stories settle into soft shapes and myth drifts slowly enough to fall asleep to. Tonight, we're wandering back farther than most stories dare to go, to a moment before gods had families, before the sky had weight, before the land had anything firm to stand on. We're going to meet Abzu, the first great being of Mesopotamian creation, a presence made of water and depth, a god so old that existence itself had barely figured out what it meant to exist. His name echoes through some of the earliest tablets humanity ever carved. His memory lives in the wells, rivers and springs that kept ancient people alive. And for a moment tonight, we'll let the old stories rise again in a way that feels calm, steady and just curious enough to follow while drifting closer to sleep. But before we settle into the oldest waters of myth, I'd like you to take a breath and notice where you are right now, not as a question, but as a gentle reminder. There is something grounding about realizing your own moment in time while stepping into a story that claims to have no beginning. You're listening from your own place, in your own space, at your own hour. Maybe it is late and quiet. Maybe your room is dim and steady. Maybe something you meant to finish earlier can wait until tomorrow. For now, you're here, and that is enough. If this soft journey into ancient worlds brings you any comfort or makes your evening a little easier, I'd be grateful if you liked the video or subscribed. It helps this space remain what it's meant to be, a calm place to wander through big ideas and long-forgotten myths without needing to keep your eyes open. So, settle into your pillow or your favourite chair. Let your breath fall into its natural rhythm, and ease into this story, one that begins not with fire or light, but with something far simpler and more familiar. A quiet vastness of water, stretching in every direction, waiting for the next step of creation without rushing it or pushing it forward. A world that did not yet have people, or cities, or kings, or scribes. Just a deep, almost featureless expanse that ancient storytellers eventually gave a name. They called it Abzu, and in their eyes, he was not just water. He was the source beneath everything. He was the moment before the beginning. The clay tablets that describe him don't rush through their words. They never pretend that creation began with a dramatic burst or a chaotic explosion. Instead, they describe something gentle, steady, and patient. A world in which the very first presence wasn't fire or sky, or even a conscious spark. It was water so ancient that it didn't need to move quickly or announce itself loudly. It simply existed because existence itself didn't know anything else yet. That's the world in which the story of Abzu begins, and it's a world that feels surprisingly suitable for a slow evening. Imagine a time when nothing was divided into land or sky. There were no seasons, no sunrises or sunsets, no winds, no storms, no waves, just a boundless, still expanse. When the earliest Sumerian scribes pressed their styluses into soft clay, they weren't trying to make this place mystical. They weren't aiming for poetry. They were describing what they believed to be the most practical truth of existence. Everything came from water. Everything depended on water. Everything returned to water. Their world revolved around rivers that could feed a city or destroy it. Wells that meant survival. Springs that whispered ancient memory. And so, when they imagined the origin of all things, they pictured a vast reservoir beneath the world, a deep and patient body of water that gave life and shaped creation. That was Abzu. The stories don't treat him as a fully formed personality. They do not assign him the dramatic flair of later gods. He doesn't arrive in thunder or command storms or carry weapons in the early myths. He's more like a presence, a condition of reality, something that was simply there because reality needed a foundation. Modern readers sometimes try to make him more poetic or symbolic, but the early texts never insist on that. They describe him plainly, clearly, and without unnecessary decoration. Abzu is fresh water. Abzu is the deep reservoir beneath the earth. Abzu is the origin from which the gods emerge. That's it. The simplicity is part of what makes him feel ancient. older than the need to explain anything, but slowly the stories begin to shift. They evolve, they deepen. Later Babylonian scribes add connections, relationships and dynamics. Abzu becomes part of a pair. He is joined with Tiamat, the saltwater sea. Where he is fresh, she is briny. Where he is quiet, she becomes the source of storms and shifting tides. Together, they are the first combination from which all other gods are said to arise. Not because they plan to create anything, but because creation, once it begins, seems to continue itself. Without any grand gesture, the waters mingle, and the first divine beings appear. This mixing of waters isn't portrayed as a dramatic clash. It's more like an ancient acknowledgement that creation often comes from the meeting of two things that were once separate: fresh water and salt water, stillness and movement, depth and surface. For ancient Mesopotamians, these weren't metaphors. They were observations of the world around them, turned inward into myth. Springs rose from the ground, rivers flowed into seas, rain replenished aquifers. Wells tasted different depending on their source. Life came from water that was both below and above, moving through the land in all directions. Abzu represented the reliability and generosity of these fresh waters. Tiamat represented the unpredictable, shifting, sometimes dangerous sea. Together they formed the first environment in which anything could begin. When scribes wrote their tales, they often treated these early divine generations as if they were describing a natural sequence rather than a dramatic story. They didn't rush to heroic battles or cosmic struggles. Those came later, after creation had taken a few steps. In these early lines, everything feels slow, steady, and inevitable. The gods are born because existence itself grows more complex. They emerge from water the way reeds rise from marshes, naturally, without needing a moment of spectacle. Abzu becomes a father without performing any grand action. He becomes the source simply because creation needs a beginning, and fresh water was the most logical one. For a long time, the stories seemed to treat Abzu with quiet respect. He represents the dependable side of nature, the part that supports life quietly without demanding attention. But as more gods appear in the mythic landscape, the atmosphere starts to change. The next generations introduce sound, movement, energy and activity into the once quiet world. They chatter, they shift, they bring a kind of liveliness that earlier texts describe almost like noise. This is where later myths give Abzu something closer to a personality, not because he wants power, but because he notices how different the world is becoming. The story of the younger gods growing restless isn't written with panic or urgency. It reads almost like an observation. Creation has a way of continuing whether the oldest forces approve or not. The younger gods stir. They reshape the world in ways that didn't exist before. And in this growing complexity, Abzu's quiet depth begins to feel overshadowed, pushed aside by new energies that don't understand the weight of the beginnings they came from. The texts describe Abzu becoming uneasy, aware that the world is moving into a new phase, one that he didn't choose and cannot control. But this unease doesn't erupt into immediate conflict. It's gradual. It builds like a slow tide. Abzu represents a world that values stability and order. He embodies the part of creation that prefers calm, quiet, and reliability. The new generation of gods, however, embody growth, change, noise, movement, and unpredictability. The tension isn't framed as good versus evil. It's more like the difference between an ancient spring that never changes and a river that begins to flood and twist through new land. Abzu watches the world shift and doesn't quite know how to exist in a reality that no longer resembles the one he helped anchor. For now, though, the story is still in its earlier stage. The waters are vast, the gods are young, the world is still forming itself, and the presence of Abzu hasn't yet reached the turning point that will reshape everything. Instead, we remain in this early moment, the one that feels slow enough to match the pace of drifting thoughts and the quiet rhythm of breathing at the end of a long day. Because the story of Abzu isn't just about myth, It reflects something ancient in the way humans understood their environment. The lower Mesopotamian world depended on aquifers, springs, riverbeds, and seasonal floods. Beneath the surface of their cities lay layers of silt and sand that held water in ways that felt stable and mysterious. If you dug deep enough, you reached the hidden reservoir that made the land fertile. To the people who lived in this region, this unseen body of fresh water wasn't a poetic symbol. It was a literal force that shaped their survival. Giving it a name, giving it a presence, giving it a role in creation wasn't an act of imagination. It was an act of clarity. It explained the hidden foundations of their world in a language they could carve into clay. So as we stand here at the beginning of the story, with Abzu still vast and steady, with the world still young and slow, we let the earliest threads of myth settle around us. Not as something distant or unreachable, but as something steady, patient, and familiar. In the same way we rely on quiet routines at the end of the day, ancient storytellers relied on the quiet depths of Abzu to explain where their world began. And as we move forward into the next part of this journey, the waters continue to stretch outward, still waiting, still forming, still shaping the path that lies ahead. When you move farther back than the familiar myths, before the storm gods argued, before kings asked for blessings, before temples rose from baked brick and reed mats, you reach a place where the world hasn't yet decided what shape to take. It doesn't have mountains or valleys, it doesn't have a sky, it doesn't have a horizon or seasons or directions that mean anything. Even calling it a place might be too confident. The ancient scribes weren't trying to paint a picture. They were trying to describe the most fundamental beginning they could imagine, and what they described was simple in a way that feels almost soothing. It was just water. A quiet, undivided depth without ripples, without waves, without any signs of life. A world that didn't rush or churn or compete with itself. A world that waited. In these earlier stories, nothing is born yet. There are no gods with personalities, no storms, no creatures. There isn't even a need for action. The tablets that have survived thousands of years don't introduce these waters with fanfare. They don't try to make them dramatic. They present them plainly, as if the calm at the start of creation makes perfect sense. The beginning wasn't loud, it wasn't bright, it was still and steady. Something that existed because there had to be a starting point, and this starting point was water that stretched farther than anyone could imagine. The people who shaped these stories lived in a world where water explained almost everything. The rivers carried life to dry soil. Floods carved new paths without permission. Wells revealed deep layers of earth and memory. When they told stories about beginnings, they didn't need fire or lightning or cosmic battles. They chose something they knew intimately. Water moves through the land quietly. Water sinks into hidden places and rests there. Water keeps cities alive without making a sound. It made sense to them that before anything else, there was only a vast undisturbed deep. No gods walked through this early world because there weren't any yet. The concept of God hadn't even been formed. There were no names to carve into clay, no families or generations, no one to rule the waters or rise from them. The deep existed on its own, not as a being who made choices, but as a condition that came before choice. These waters didn't speak or think, they simply were. Modern readers sometimes imagine this moment as mysterious or symbolic, but the original storytellers didn't present it that way. They treated this beginning as something straightforward. Everything has a source, every city has a foundation, every river has a hidden starting point. The universe, in their eyes, followed the same rule. Its foundation was water so old that nothing else had formed yet. This world wasn't dark or light. It wasn't cold or warm. It didn't have qualities that required contrast. Light didn't exist. Darkness didn't exist. Those categories hadn't been invented. It wasn't empty the way we think of emptiness. It was full of stillness, full of waiting, full of potential that hadn't begun to move. The scribes don't describe it as silent because silence is something we notice only when sound exists. In this earlier stage, there was no sound to compare anything to. There was only the soft, steady presence of primordial waters. When we talk about this moment in hindsight, it can be tempting to add details that the original stories never used. Ideas about nothingness or emptiness or chaos can slip in because they're familiar to us. But the ancient Mesopotamians didn't use those ideas the same way. They didn't start with voids or storms. They started with something that felt reliable, something that matched the way they saw life appear after floods, or how springs emerged without warning from deep below the ground. Water wasn't an abstract symbol for them. It was the real, physical substance that made their survival possible. So when they imagined the beginning, they imagined a version of reality where the thing they depended on most existed first. Not as a resource, not as a tool, but as the literal material of creation, a world where everything else came later, carrying traits that grew from this slow, patient starting point. Abzu didn't have a name yet in this moment. The word hadn't been invented. The concept hadn't settled into form. He wasn't a god, not yet. He wasn't anything you could describe as conscious. In this earlier stage, he is only water without boundaries, a depth that stretches so far the mind cannot map it. Later myths give him a presence. Later stories turn him into a figure with roles and relationships. But before all of that, he's just the quiet foundation beneath an unstructured universe. If you imagine sinking through these early waters, you wouldn't see anything. Not because it's dark, but because sight itself doesn't exist. There is nothing to reflect or illuminate, no shapes or features, no roots or currents, just an endless environment without edges, waiting for change but not demanding it. The closest comparison is perhaps the moment before waking, where everything is calm and suspended. But even that fails because this world doesn't have sleep or waking. Those ideas belong to beings who haven't been created yet. What makes this stage feel so steady is that nothing is trying to reshape it. There are no winds to stir the surface, no creatures moving through it, no voices calling from above or below. There is only the gentle weight of water, and the knowledge, written millennia later, that this was the world's earliest form. It's not dramatic, it's not hidden, it's simply the first condition of existence. Sometimes when people look back at ancient myths, they imagine grand beginnings full of conflict or meaning. But Mesopotamian creation begins with calm. Before there was noise, before there was rivalry, before there was story, there was patience. There was a world that took its time, a world where nothing rushed to take shape, a world where being still was enough. This stillness may seem strange to us because modern stories often leap to action. But for ancient people, the idea that the beginning was slow made sense. Life around them unfolded slowly. Mud settled at its own pace. Crops grew at their own pace. The flooding of the rivers followed a natural cycle that couldn't be sped up or delayed. Everything took time, so the idea that the universe began with quiet, steady water fit the rhythm of the world they lived in. When later myths describe gods forming or rising from these waters, they make it clear that creation wasn't an explosion or a violent spark. It was a gradual emergence. Things didn't appear instantly. They developed. They grew. The waters that existed before anything else provided the conditions that made creation possible without rushing it. Abzu's earliest form reflects that. He begins not as a ruler, but as a foundation. Not as a voice, but as a quiet environment. It's worth noting that the earliest tablets don't describe these waters as chaotic. That interpretation came from much later readings influenced by different cultures and eras. In the oldest stories, the primordial waters were not unruly or threatening. They were simply the raw material of reality. The deep wasn't something to fear. It was something that explained where everything came from. It was familiar. It was steady. It was the one thing people could rely on, whether they were building canals or watching the rivers rise each season. This early moment doesn't rush toward the next part of the story. It doesn't need to. The foundation of creation is slow and patient. It needs space to settle, the same way a day needs time to unwind before sleep. Ancient scribes allowed this stage to be unhurried. They didn't skip ahead. They didn't compress the beginning into a single dramatic sentence. They gave the early waters room to exist because beginnings often need room. As time moved forward and these stories evolved, the waters would eventually take shape as Abzu, the first great presence of creation. But here, before any names are spoken, before any gods appear, the world rests in a kind of gentle suspension. The waters exist, and that is enough for now. When we think about this moment today, it's easy to imagine it as distant or unreachable. But the feeling it carries is surprisingly familiar. It resembles the quiet moments just before sleep, when the mind hasn't yet shifted into dreams or dropped fully into rest. A slow drift, a soft pause, a moment of stillness where nothing needs to be defined and nothing needs to be decided. The earliest world of myth shares that same rhythm, not because it was designed to be comforting, but because stillness was simply the first thing existence ever experienced. In this early state, nothing divides the world into categories. There's no above or below, no difference between surface and depth. The concept of surface doesn't exist yet. Everything is part of one continuous unbroken body. Only later, when creation unfolds, will boundaries begin to form. But here, boundaries haven't been invented. The waters don't need them. If someone who lived thousands of years ago stood at the edge of a river and thought about where it came from, they might imagine these early waters as something that still flowed beneath their feet, something ancient and steady, older than memory. They didn't think of the beginning as a distant myth. They thought of it as something still present and alive, something that moved beneath the earth and through their daily lives. Abzu wasn't just a figure from an old story. He was the deep reservoir that fed their wells and springs, a reminder of the constant source beneath everything. Eventually these waters would give rise to gods. Eventually creation would begin to move. But in this moment, nothing rushes, nothing pushes, nothing reaches for form. The world stays exactly as it is, suspended in a calm that feels natural and unforced. As we move on from this early stillness, the waters will begin to shift. Not quickly, not dramatically, but gradually, the way a thought drifts at the edge of sleep. Creation will begin to take shape, and from this quiet depth, the first presence will slowly emerge, ready to take its place in the story that follows. When the earliest world had settled into its long stretch of quiet waters, something began to shift, not with noise or sudden force, but with the kind of slow development that feels almost natural once you look back at it. The storytellers who shaped these myths never described a moment where everything suddenly sprang to life. They didn't imagine the beginning of the first god as dramatic. They didn't add thunder or sudden flashes. They described the change in a way that matched their understanding of how the world behaves. Things grow, things rise, things develop. The waters that had existed before anything else eventually began to hold more than stillness. They held the beginnings of identity. In time, the earlier scribes named this first presence Abzu, but his birth, if we can even use that word, didn't resemble the kind of event we imagine today. There was no defined point where he suddenly appeared. Instead, it was more like the waters gradually became aware of what they were. The deep, fresh reservoir beneath the forming world didn't transform into a god because something external acted upon it. It transformed because creation itself was slowly learning to organize. The earliest myths treat this moment like a natural step rather than a surprise. Before Abzu had a name, the waters simply existed. But as the world developed and the need for structure increased, the ancient storytellers recognized a pattern. The fresh waters underlying everything weren't just a raw material. They were stable. They were consistent. They supported everything above them. They weren't chaotic or unpredictable. They created the right conditions for life to take form. These qualities made them feel like more than a formless environment. They began to resemble something with intention, or at least something with a steady presence that could be described like a being. When the scribes finally chose to name this presence, they weren't trying to turn the waters into a character in a play. They were doing what most early myth makers did. They were acknowledging that something so essential, so foundational, so constant, deserved recognition. Giving the primordial waters a name wasn't an attempt to give them personality. It was a way to honour the role they played in creation, and once a name existed, the waters could take on a new form within the story. Abzu wasn't born the way later gods were. He didn't arise from another deity or emerge from a dramatic union. He wasn't the child of anything. He was the beginning. His birth is more like the moment when the earlier storytellers recognised him. Before that, he was just water without form. After that, he became the first presence capable of shaping what came next, even if he didn't act with intention or will. This subtle shift is important because it reveals how ancient Mesopotamians thought about the world. They didn't imagine creation as something that required a dramatic creator with a grand plan. They imagined creation unfolding gradually. It was enough for the first god to be a presence that existed because the world needed structure. Abzu didn't appear to command or rule. He appeared because the world had reached a point where naming the waters made sense. The scribes described him as the fresh water beneath the earth, a reservoir that fed rivers, springs, wells, and all the life that depended on them. This wasn't a symbolic idea. This was their understanding of how the world worked. They lived in a region where the land depended on underground aquifers. They dug wells and found water waiting beneath the surface. They watched rivers swell from hidden sources. To them, the idea that a living, meaningful presence existed beneath the earth was not imaginative embellishment. It was a reflection of reality. When they wrote about Abzu, they were giving language to a truth they experienced every day. His role wasn't invented. It was recognized. As the waters gained identity, the world began its slow transition from an undivided expanse into something more structured. Abzu became the first part of this shift. He was the quiet foundation that no longer sat nameless. In giving him a name, the scribes acknowledged that the waters had purpose. They didn't act randomly. They nourished everything that would come after. They were dependable, steady, and essential. From this foundation, the rest of creation could develop. In some myths, the birth of Abzu is tied to the moment the waters deepen their meaning. When he becomes a presence rather than just an element, the story gains its first anchor. Before him, there is only environment. After him, there is existence with structure. The myth doesn't describe the waters suddenly rising or shifting. Instead, it describes a kind of recognition. The fresh waters are no longer just an expanse. They are Abzu, the first being capable of influencing what will come next. It's worth noting that even when Abzu becomes a recognized figure, the stories still don't describe him with dramatic traits. He doesn't speak. He doesn't command. He doesn't form things with intention. He exists with the same calm he had before, only now the world acknowledges him. This approach is consistent with how ancient storytellers viewed the early stages of creation. They didn't need the first presence to act with purpose. They needed him to exist in a way that made the rest possible. Abzu's earliest form is quiet. He represents stability. He represents continuity. His defining quality is not action, but presence. This makes the story feel grounded and calm, which is fitting for a god associated with water that moves slowly through the earth, nourishing life without announcing itself. When later myths expand on his role, they give him characteristics that develop from this original identity. He becomes the patient, rooted part of creation. He becomes the foundation from which younger gods arise. His nature stays consistent with his beginnings. He is steady rather than dynamic, supportive rather than impulsive. But in this early stage, before the myths add family relationships or conflicts, Abzu remains close to his original form. The first stories describe him in a way that matches the pace of the world before creation moved into motion. He does not rush. He does not push. He exists the way water rests beneath the earth, quiet, patient, and essential. When the myths begin to describe the next step in creation, they don't abandon this calm. They let the emergence of new gods feel natural. The deeper waters of Abzu begin to interact with the salt sea of Tiamat, not through sudden conflict, but through gradual combination. The fresh water and salt water mingle. The scribes describe this stage without rushing, the same way the early world did not rush. The birth of Abzu as a distinct being sets the stage for the birth of everything else. To understand why this moment mattered so much to ancient people, it helps to think about how they viewed the connection between water and life. They didn't see water as something separate from the world. They saw it as the thing that made the world possible. Springs appeared unexpectedly in the desert. Rivers cut through dry land and made it fertile. Wells revealed water deep beneath the soil. All of this shaped their understanding of existence. So when they imagined the earlier stage of the universe, they didn't think in terms of emptiness or void. They thought in terms of hidden reservoirs, quiet and steady, older than the world above them. To name this reservoir was to acknowledge that life came from beneath. Abzu's birth was not a moment of transformation, but a moment of recognition. The earliest waters that had existed quietly now had identity. This identity allowed creation to move forward. Once something in the universe had a name, it had structure. Once it had structure, it could relate to other things. It could participate in what came next. The birth of Abzu marks the moment when the universe gained its first organizing presence, something that could support the rise of later gods, not through intention, but through existence. Abzu's nature as fresh water wasn't chosen at random. Fresh water represented life. It represented growth. It represented the difference between surviving and thriving. A city without fresh water could not exist. A field without irrigation could not grow. A community without wells could not sustain itself. Ancient Mesopotamian cities were built beside rivers for a reason. Their survival depended entirely on the water that flowed beneath and through their land. It made sense to them that creation itself depended on the same thing. When Abzu becomes a distinct presence in myth, the world doesn't dramatically change. It simply becomes more aware of itself. A foundation begins to take form. The waters that had existed before now carry meaning. The next phases of creation rely on this meaning. Without a steady source beneath the world, nothing could hold together. This stage of the story feels calm because it reflects the nature of the being it describes. Abzu does not act with the rush of later gods, who stir storms or bring light. He does not move with speed. He is slow and steady. When storytellers named him, they didn't imagine him as restless or ambitious. They imagined him as the first part of creation to hold a role. From this quiet presence, the mixture of waters that will eventually bring forth the younger gods can begin. Abzu's birth is not the moment creation begins. It is the moment creation becomes aware that it has begun. This early stage doesn't try to leap ahead. It doesn't introduce conflict or movement too soon. It lets the waters settle into identity before anything else happens. The quiet depth becomes Abzu because creation needs something firm, steady, and dependable to stand on before it moves forward. As Abzu's presence begins to take shape, the world shifts just enough to prepare for what comes next. Not quickly, not loudly, but naturally, the way spring seeps slowly into riverbeds, shaping the land without forcing it. From here, creation will begin to expand. The waters will mingle, new beings will arise. The calm foundation will support the growth that follows, and the story continues to unfold at its own unhurried pace, carried gently toward the next moment in the long and patient beginning of everything. As the earliest world drifted in its long stretch of quiet, something began to change. Not with a dramatic break or a sudden spark, but with a kind of gradual shift that feels natural once it has already happened. The deep, fresh waters that would become Abzu existed on their own for a time, steady and patient, shaping nothing yet supporting everything that would eventually grow. But the universe wasn't meant to stay suspended forever. At some point, at least in the way ancient scribes told it, The stillness gave way to movement. Creation didn't leap into being, it stirred. The ancient storytellers describe this moment with the same steady tone they use for the beginning. They didn't frame the first movement as chaotic or violent. They didn't suggest that the waters clashed or churned. Instead, they described a simple meeting. The fresh waters of Abzu began to mingle with another vast body that had also existed since the earliest beginnings. This was Tiamat, the saltwater sea. She was not yet the force that later myths depicted with storms and upheaval. She was simply the counterpart to Abzu, the salt to his fresh, the sea to his deep reservoir, the open waters to his hidden foundation. The stories never say these two waters sought each other out. They don't describe intent or purpose. They don't suggest that change came because someone made a decision. Instead, they present the meeting of fresh and salt water as something inevitable. When two elements exist side by side long enough, they eventually find a way to combine. Springs seep into riverbeds, rivers run into seas, rain falls into both. Fresh and salt meet naturally. The myths reflect this simple truth. What happened at the beginning of creation was not the result of ambition or desire. It was the result of nature reaching a new stage. The moment these two waters met, the universe began to shift from stillness into movement. The ancient storytellers described this meeting without exaggeration. They didn't add tension. They didn't add conflict. They didn't insist the world trembled. They simply noted that when the quiet fresh waters mingled with the broad salt waters, something new became possible. The stories say that this mixture produced the earliest gods, not because the waters wanted to create them, but because creation tends to begin when two different things come into contact. The image of fresh water meeting salt water wasn't symbolic to the people who first told these stories. It was something they saw every day. The rivers they depended on flowed into the sea. The marshes where they fished and gathered reeds held a mix of both. Streams met canals, wells filled with water that had travelled through layers of soil, eventually making their way to brackish estuaries. The cycle was familiar. It reflected life. It made sense that the first stage of creation involved a mixing of waters. Before this moment, Abzu existed alone in a state that felt complete enough. But once the salted deep met the fresh reservoir, the world gained a new layer. It gained contrast. It gained movement. Even if the storytellers never described it with dramatic language, they recognized that something fundamental had changed. The waters were no longer separate states. The universe now held combinations, mixtures, and interactions. Life, as the ancient scribes understood it, came from combinations. This interaction didn't happen all at once. The earliest myths portray creation as a slow process. Fresh water didn't suddenly rise up to meet the salt. Salt didn't surge toward the fresh. It was more like a gradual blending, similar to the way two springs seep together underground, or how a river delta slowly spreads into the sea. The stories don't rush to the appearance of the younger gods. They let the process unfold at a pace that feels steady and patient. Abzu remained the quiet foundation. Tiamat became the vast saltwater counterpart, and between them, something began to take shape. The early texts say that the mingling of their waters formed the first generation of divine beings. These weren't gods with defined personalities yet. They were simply the earliest movements of creation, the first signs that the world was beginning to organize itself. The scribes didn't describe these early gods as fully formed. They didn't give them stories or traits right away. They simply acknowledged that they appeared because the world had reached a point where stillness was no longer the only state available. From the union of fresh and salt water came the earliest forces capable of shaping existence, even if they didn't yet have names or identities. For ancient Mesopotamians, this moment where fresh and salt water met wasn't just myth, it was reality. The land they lived in sat between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, a place where the soil depended on the predictable swelling of waters, where marshlands shifted with the seasons, and where salt and fresh water met in tidal movements that shaped the coastline. Their environment taught them that new life forms where different waters combine. Reed beds sprout in brackish marshes, fish gather where rivers meet the sea, birds feed where the two waters merge. So the idea that the universe began when fresh and salt water mingled wasn't fantastical. It reflected the patterns around them. In this moment of the story, Abzu doesn't lose his nature. He remains steady, calm and foundational. Tiamat remains expansive. Neither of them acts with intention. Neither force tries to guide the mixture. The early scribes didn't describe this stage as a negotiation or a deliberate choice. They saw it as part of the natural order of things. Water mixes, life follows. That's how the world behaves, both in myth and in daily experience. As fresh water and salt water meet, the universe transitions from a simple state to a more complex one. The mixture becomes fertile. It becomes capable of producing forms that didn't exist before. In the earliest texts, this is when creation truly begins, not with a spark or an explosion, but with a gentle blending. The quiet depth meets the salted sea, and the result is life. The first beings that arise from this mixture are often described with minimal detail. The myths call them younger gods, but they don't rush into describing what they are or what they do. They simply exist because the world has entered a new stage. The earliest texts describe them as forming within the waters, not emerging from above or below, but appearing as a natural result of the meeting itself. This approach keeps the tone of creation grounded, steady, and familiar. Nothing happens abruptly. Nothing interrupts the calm. Everything takes shape in a process that resembles the slow growth of reeds or the gradual settling of silt at the bottom of a river. This early generation of gods represents the beginning of movement and sound. But in this stage of the story, that movement is still faint. It hasn't yet reached a level that disturbs the calm. It's simply the first sign that the world is shifting into a new phase. The mixture of waters has begun to produce something more than stillness, but it hasn't yet changed the character of the early world. The myths of this early moment carry a sense of balance. Fresh and salt meet, neither overtaking the other. The mixture is not described as a struggle. It is described as a condition that leads naturally into the next stage of creation. The early scribes didn't choose water as the starting point because it felt dramatic. They chose it because it was the most essential resource in their world. They saw what happened when fresh and salt water met. They saw how estuaries formed ecosystems. They saw how fields grew when river water mixed with mineral-rich soil. They saw life emerge from mixtures that seemed simple but produced complexity. The idea that creation began with calm, steady water aligns with this understanding. It reflects a worldview shaped by rivers, marshlands, and the unpredictable but life-giving cycles of water. Abzu and Tiamat weren't imagined as symbols of abstract concepts. They were extensions of the environment. The fresh waters beneath the earth and the vast salt sea represented two halves of the same essential force. Their meeting wasn't a metaphor. It was a reflection of reality. As the waters mingled, the next stages of the mythic world began to gather shape. The younger gods formed. Creation found a new rhythm. But for now, the early world remains calm enough to rest within. Abzu still holds his quiet strength. Tiamat still stretches beyond the horizon, and between them something new has begun to move. It doesn't move quickly, it doesn't rush. It stirs the way mud stirs when a slow current begins to push through it. It stirs the way life appears in places where conditions finally align. This moment marks the beginning of change, but it is still gentle. Creation has shifted from stillness into movement, but the movement is steady and understated. The fresh and salt water continue to blend, slowly forming the conditions that will shape the next step of the story. The early world is no longer a uniform expanse. It has entered a phase where combinations matter, and from these combinations the forces that will shape the universe begin to gather themselves, quietly preparing for what comes next in the long unfolding of existence. When the fresh waters of Abzu and the salted deep of Tiamat settled into their shared existence, creation had already begun to change, though it changed with the same slow, patient rhythm that shaped the earliest parts of the story. Nothing in these myths rushes, nothing arrives suddenly. Even the most fundamental developments unfold with the calm steadiness of water moving through soil or a river adjusting its course over centuries. So when the ancient scribes described the moment these two primordial waters formed a union, they didn't present it as a passionate meeting or a dramatic merging. They described it as a natural step, the next shift in a universe that had been quiet for a long time and was now ready to move into a more complex stage. Abzu and Tiamat were not portrayed as opposites in the way modern readers might imagine. They weren't enemies or rivals. They weren't fire and ice, order and chaos, or any kind of symbolic contrast. They were simply the two kinds of water that ancient people recognized as the foundation of life. One was fresh and hidden beneath the earth. The other was salty and expansive on the surface. They were different but not conflicting. Their union wasn't a clash. It was a merging that reflected the real-world meeting of rivers and seas, a blending that created fertile environments, marshlands, and ecosystems where life flourished. The earliest texts didn't describe this union in emotional terms. They didn't attribute desire, affection, or strategy to these primordial beings. Abzu and Tiamat didn't choose to join together. They joined in the same way the natural world creates new conditions when its elements come into contact. Fresh and salt water blend. Environments transform. Something new appears because the world has reached a point where it can no longer stay as it was. This union is less an event and more a shift in the underlying structure of the universe. From this blending, the first divine offspring began to appear. The ancient tablets describe them as younger gods, but they didn't yet have personalities or stories. They were simply the first signs of growth within the world. Their appearance wasn't the result of intention, nor was it the result of conflict. Creation emerged because the conditions finally allowed it. When the primordial waters mingled, they produced the earliest forces capable of shaping existence. These new beings weren't described in detail. Their names appear in later versions of the story, but in the earliest layers of the myth, they are simply acknowledged as the natural children of the two waters. Their existence marks the moment when the universe shifts from a quiet, undisturbed state into one that contains movement, sound, and the beginnings of complexity. They bring activity into a world that had previously known only stillness. They don't act out of rebellion or intention. They act simply because existence has reached a new phase. As more divine beings emerged from the mingling waters, the world became less silent. The children of Abzu and Tiamat were the first forces to create change. They stirred the depths. They altered the rhythms of the early universe. They brought motion where there had previously been none. But the stories never portray this early activity as chaotic. They describe it as development, the way the land shifts when a new river forms, or how a coastline changes when fresh water pushes into the sea. It's important to remember that ancient Mesopotamian myth was shaped by an environment where water was the most powerful force. Rivers created boundaries, floods reshaped entire regions, marshlands supported life in ways the dry land couldn't. The union of fresh and salt water wasn't abstract to these people, it was observable. They saw how new life thrived in brackish environments, where different waters joined to create fertile ground for plants, fish, animals, and eventually people. The idea that the first gods came from the meeting of different waters wasn't symbolic, it was practical. The early children of Abzu and Tiamat reflected this understanding. They were the natural outcome of creation's first mixture. Their presence represented the potential that arises when two forces combine. The myths give them names later, Lamu, Lahamu, Anshar, Kishar. But in this stage of the story they are simply described as the earliest movements of existence, beings who added sound and activity to the previously silent world. As these children grew in number, the world began to change even more. The calm waters of Abzu no longer existed in complete stillness. The presence of younger gods introduced new dynamics. The early texts describe them as stirring, shifting, or moving. These descriptions aren't dramatic. They read more like observations. The children of the primordial waters created noise, and not necessarily the kind that signals trouble. It was just the natural sound of existence becoming more complex. The stories do not present the early children as disruptive in a hostile or malicious sense. They simply behave like anything newly formed, energetic, curious, and unrestrained. They represent movement in a world that had only known stillness. For a time, this shift coexisted with the calm foundation of Abzu and the broad waters of Tiamat. Creation wasn't yet divided into sides or tensions, it was simply expanding. But as the younger gods continued to grow in number and activity, the world reached a new point. The early scribes described their noise increasing. Not noise as a metaphor, but as literal, uncontained movement and energy. Creation was no longer quiet. The waters began to vibrate with the presence of these new beings. The steady deep of Abzu started to feel less calm. The vastness of Tiamat began to hold more motion than it had before. At first, this change doesn't create conflict. It simply marks another stage in the gradual development of the universe. Fresh water and salt water had combined, and from their union emerged forces that would eventually shape the world. These younger gods represented the first shift away from the calm of the primordial waters. They were neither good nor bad. They were simply new. Their existence carried the energy of beginnings. This is where the story takes its first subtle turn. The early world that had existed in quiet for so long was no longer quiet. The children of Abzu and Tiamat didn't recognize the stillness that came before them. They only knew the growing world they had been born into. Their movement reflected the natural energy of youth. They stirred the waters. They shifted the currents. They filled the primordial world with activity that neither Abzu nor Tiamat had ever experienced. The myths describe this shift in a calm, steady tone. They don't portray the younger gods as reckless or destructive. They simply acknowledge that their presence changed the early world. Their energy disrupted the long-standing stillness, not as an act of rebellion, but as a natural consequence of existence becoming more complex. In the same way that streams eventually erode new paths, or winds reshape sand dunes, the younger gods reshaped the dynamics of creation. For a while, Abzu and Tiamat tolerated this shift. They existed for ages before their children appeared, and they continued to exist without immediate reaction to the growing noise. But gradually the change became more noticeable. The younger gods filled the world with sound, movement, and unpredictability. The primordial waters, once undisturbed for uncountable ages, now held forces that moved with a different rhythm. At this stage, the myth does not describe conflict. It simply describes tension growing quietly beneath the surface. Abzu, who had represented the calm foundation of creation, now felt the weight of the younger god's activity. Tiamat, who had always existed with expansive patience, now held movements within her that she had never needed to manage before. The early world was shifting from calm to lively, and the first divine union had created more than either primordial being had expected. But even in this moment where tension begins to rise, the story remains slow, steady, and grounded. The ancient scribes did not leap suddenly into conflict. They didn't portray Abzu or Tiamat as reacting with immediate force. They allowed the tension to grow at its natural pace. Abzu's discomfort doesn't turn into action yet. Tiamat's role remains steady. The younger gods continue their movements with the energy of new existence. This early period reflects the nature of creation as the ancient Mesopotamians understood it. The world doesn't change all at once. It changes gradually, through processes that unfold slowly and continuously. The union of Abzu and Tiamat created the conditions for life, and life introduced noise, unpredictability, and movement. None of this was described as unnatural. It was simply the next step in the unfolding story. From this union came everything that would define the rest of the mythic world. The younger gods would eventually take shape. Their identities would develop. Their actions would influence the early universe, but for now, they remained forces of movement rather than defined individuals. Their birth marks the moment when creation begins to shift away from pure stillness and toward activity. This transition is not yet dramatic. It is still quiet enough to sit within. The universe hasn't fractured. Abzu and Tiamat have not yet taken stands. The world continues to blend fresh and salt. The waters still hold their early shape, but the presence of movement, the sound of younger gods shifting within the depths, signals that creation is preparing for the next stage of its long unfolding story. When the quiet meeting of fresh and salt water had taken place, and the first divine union settled into its slow rhythm, the early universe shifted again. Not in a way that resembled an awakening with noise or urgency, but in a way that followed the same soft logic that had shaped everything up to this point. Nothing in these myths jumps, nothing bursts into sudden life. Instead, creation unfolds the way water spreads into soil, gradually, quietly, and with a kind of inevitability that feels steady rather than surprising. The world didn't open its eyes all at once. It stirred as if convinced by the gentle nudging of its own foundations. From the blending of Abzu and Tiamat's waters, the first younger gods began to form. The scribes didn't describe them as emerging from dramatic storms or sudden convulsions. They described them as rising in a world that had been still for so long that any movement felt like a soft shift rather than a disruption. These younger gods weren't imagined as fully developed personalities in the earliest versions of the myth. They were forces, new presences that brought motion into a universe that had previously known only calm. Their rising is described without the emotional framing modern stories tend to use. There is no fear, no excitement, no awe narrated into the moment. The tablets simply acknowledge that when the fresh and salt water mingled, new beings appeared. They emerge the way life tends to emerge when the right conditions are met, not as an accident, not as an act of will, as a natural development. The earliest of these divine beings are often named in later stories: Lahmu, Lahamu, Anshar, Kishar. But in this moment of the myth, their names don't matter yet. They are simply the first signs that the universe has begun to generate complexity. Before their appearance, creation was a single state, calm waters stretching endlessly. With them, creation becomes something with variation. Movement replaces stillness. Sound replaces silence. Activity begins in a place that had previously known none. To the ancient storytellers, this wasn't a moment of chaos. It wasn't even a moment of tension. It was the beginning of organization. The younger gods didn't emerge to challenge anything. They emerged because the world had moved past the point where stillness was enough. If the union of Abzu and Tiamat represented the first shift, the rising of the younger gods represented the second, an increase in motion, not conflict. These early divine beings didn't behave like the later gods who would dominate the mythic world. They didn't yet make decisions or form alliances. They didn't carry the weight of personalities or roles. They were more like the first ripples in a previously undisturbed pool. Their presence was the beginning of activity. They stirred the waters simply by existing. The scribes didn't portray this as a threat. They portrayed it as a development, a step the universe was always going to take. The idea that the world woke slowly through water matched the understanding the early Mesopotamians had of their environment. Life around them depended on the behaviour of rivers, marshes, and underground springs. They watched water bring reeds to life. They saw crops grow when irrigation channels filled. They witnessed how life returned to fields after floodwaters receded. In their world, life came from water rising slowly, not from sudden fire or violent upheaval. So the myth reflected that. The first gods were not made of lightning or flame. They rose from water. These gods embodied qualities that reflected the world's earlier steps towards structure. Lahmu and Lahamu, the first pair mentioned in later texts, were described not as warriors or rulers, but as beings representing openness and extension. Anshar and Kisha represented the beginnings of the sky and the horizon, not yet defined as places but as concepts forming within the world. These early gods illustrated the universe starting to give itself shape, but only in broad strokes. The world was still learning how to organize itself. This stage of creation doesn't hurry to define anything. It doesn't rush to assign roles. It allows the universe to expand at its own pace. The younger gods appear, they move, and their movement changes the waters gently. Abzu and Tiamat remain as they were, fresh and salt, deep and expansive, steady and patient. The world now holds more beings, but the foundation beneath it remains unchanged. The presence of these younger gods marked the first moment where multiple things existed within the same space. Before this, the world was a single undifferentiated mass. Now, the early universe held different presences, even if those presences didn't yet have full identities. The myth begins to shift from describing existence to describing relationships, though the relationships are still simple and without conflict. The younger gods stirred the waters with their movements. They created vibrations and currents. They added texture to the world's earliest environment. The ancient scribes describe this change without drama, but they do acknowledge that the motions made the primordial waters behave differently. Abzu's depths no longer held the same smooth calm. Tiamat's vast expanse no longer stretched in perfect stillness. For the first time, the waters were not uniform. This stirring wasn't framed as a problem. It was simply a new aspect of reality. When a world that has been quiet for ages begins to move, the change feels significant, even if it is gentle. The myths note the activity of the younger gods, but they don't assign it moral weight. They don't suggest it is good or bad. It simply exists. The younger gods are energetic by nature, and their energy begins to reshape the primordial waters. The scribes understood that water never stays perfectly still. Even in the calmest marsh, something eventually moves. The current forms, a reed shifts, a creature stirs beneath the surface. The mythic version of this natural observation takes the form of divine movement. The younger gods represent the universe behaving like water. They rise, they shift, and their presence spreads in ways that the earlier waters had not experienced. In this stage, Abzu remains steady, but he begins to feel the effects of the younger god's activity. The deep reservoir beneath the world had existed in a state of perfect quiet. Now that quiet was disturbed, not in a violent way, but in a way that accumulated over time. The early texts described the younger gods bringing noise, but this word didn't mean chaos. It meant activity. It meant movement. The sound they produced was the sound of creation starting to express itself. Tiamat, in contrast, responded with patience. The vast salt waters had always been larger and more open than the deep. Her nature allowed movement more easily. But even she began to feel the shift as more gods appeared. The early universe became more active, and this activity began to ripple outward. The myth does not portray her reaction as hostile or concerned yet. She simply holds the movements within her, as an ocean holds currents. For a while, the world existed in this soft combination of calm and movement. Fresh and salt water still defined the foundation, but now the first gods were rising, and their presence gave the waters new texture. It created an environment that would eventually support more structured forms of existence. The early universe was still young, still learning how to shape itself, but the first steps had already been taken. This moment in the myth is significant not because of its drama, but because of its simplicity. Creation is beginning to build momentum. The younger gods represent the first signs that the universe will not remain in soft stillness forever. They embody the principle that once life begins, it expands. Once motion begins, it continues. Once a world wakes, it does not go back to sleep. But the myths don't rush into the consequences of this development. They stay with the early stage long enough to let the reader settle into it. They allow the world to feel open and fluid. They give the younger gods room to exist without yet assigning them the responsibilities or conflicts that will come later. This slow pacing reflects the nature of early creation. It isn't hurried, it is deliberate in its simplicity. The ancient Mesopotamians saw the universe as something that grew in layers. Water came first, then movement, then form, then structure. Each stage built upon the last. The rising of the younger gods fit this gradual pattern. They mark the point where creation began to develop upward and outward rather than simply resting beneath the surface. Their movement also marked the first time that Abzu and Tiamat needed to respond to something new. They didn't react immediately. They didn't take sides or plan actions. They simply continued to exist while the younger gods stirred the waters. But beneath this calm, the foundation of the myth was shifting. Abzu felt pressure in a way he had not before. Tiamat sensed motion on a scale that was unfamiliar. The world was changing, not in a sudden way, not in a destructive way, but in a way that indicated more changes would come. These early gods were not described as agents of trouble, but they represented the momentum that would eventually lead to tension. In this moment, though, the myth stays with the world as it is, young, fluid, and filled with new movement. The waters have awakened, and creation is quietly preparing to step into its next stage. For now, the world is still largely shaped by water. Abzu remains the fresh depths. Tiamat remains the broad salt sea. The younger gods rise between them, adding energy to the earliest environment. The universe is no longer silent. It is no longer suspended. It has begun to move, and the movement will continue to grow as the story enters the next part of its long unfolding journey. As creation continued to stretch and gather itself, the earliest world entered a stage it had never experienced before. The younger gods, born from the meeting of fresh and salt water, grew in number and in activity. Their presence filled the once still universe with movement. Their energy stirred the depths, rippled through the broad sea, and created a kind of rhythm the primordial waters had not known. Nothing about this shift was sudden. It developed the way sound builds in a quiet room, layer by layer, until the silence is no longer the dominant presence. For a long time, the beginnings of this activity didn't disturb anything. The world welcomed motion in a way that felt natural. After ages of calm, a little movement wasn't unwelcome. It simply meant creation was growing. But the pace of this new existence gradually intensified. The younger gods acted with the unrestrained energy of beings who had no memory of stillness. They had never lived in a world without motion. They did not understand how quiet things had once been. They shifted through the waters, they stirred currents, and they produced sounds that echoed through the depths. The ancient texts describe this shift in simple terms. They say the younger gods made noise, but the word in the original language suggested more than sound. It meant agitation, motion, vibration. It meant the waters were no longer steady. The calm that had defined the earliest universe began to fade. Abzu, who had existed in quiet for longer than anyone could measure, began to feel the weight of this change. He had not chosen to become a father. He had not acted with intention to create anything. The younger gods had arisen because creation demanded complexity. Abzu had simply been the first foundation from which this complexity grew. He had watched the early world shift, had accepted the blending of fresh and salt waters, had allowed creation to move past stillness, and for a time, this development didn't trouble him. But eventually the movement of the younger gods grew too constant, too disruptive, too unfamiliar. The myths describe his reaction in a measured tone. They don't present him as malicious or spiteful. They don't portray him as a tyrant angered by disobedience. They describe him as a being overwhelmed by a world that no longer resembled the one he had known for ages. Abzu, the fresh and silent deep, found himself surrounded by motion that never stopped. The rhythm of creation had changed, and he struggled to adjust to it. The ancient scribes were careful with this moment. They didn't frame Abzu as a villain. They framed him as a presence rooted in an earlier world, a world defined by quiet, slowness, and stillness. When new forces changed that world, he responded not from cruelty but from discomfort. The waters that had once rested undisturbed now pulsed with constant activity. The younger gods moved without awareness of the impact they had on the foundation beneath them. This is where the story shifts into its first real tension, but even this tension doesn't appear as sudden conflict. The myths describe Abzu's agitation gradually. He becomes restless. The deep, which had always been steady, now holds movement it cannot reconcile. His frustration isn't a burst of emotion. It builds slowly, the way pressure builds beneath the surface of a riverbank as new channels form. Abzu felt these shifts in a way the younger gods did not. They acted without understanding the structure beneath their movements. They didn't know that the waters had once been still. They didn't understand that their constant activity was altering the balance of creation. They simply existed as they were formed, active, energetic, new. Their presence filled the world with life, but it filled the deep with disturbance. The ancient storytellers use this moment to explain something fundamental about the nature of creation. The earliest forces, steady and foundational, can struggle when new forms introduce movement. Change does not come easily to what has existed in stillness for ages. Abzu represented stability, and stability can become uneasy when the world moves too quickly. This wasn't a commentary on morality. It was an observation on how different forces in nature behave. The myths describe Abzu eventually speaking of his discomfort. He confided in Tiamat, the saltwater sea, who had always been broader and more accommodating of movement. She listened as he expressed his frustration, not with anger, but with heaviness. He spoke of wanting to restore the quiet that had once defined the earliest world. The ancient texts portray this desire with clarity. Abzu longed for calm. He longed for the world he had known before. He wanted the waters to return to their undisturbed state. This longing eventually turned into something more decisive. The myths say that Abzu planned to silence the younger gods, not out of cruelty, not out of rivalry, but out of a desire to return to the only order he understood. The idea of silencing in the oldest versions of the myth doesn't carry the violent tone that later interpretations added to it. It simply meant removing the agitation, removing the movement, returning the waters to stillness. For Abzu, this made sense. The younger gods were not behaving maliciously, they were simply active. But his nature could not adjust to their constant presence. The myth presents him as a being caught between the world he had been part of for ages and the world that was emerging without his guidance. Tiamat reacted differently. The early texts emphasize that she was slower to anger and slower to reject her children. Her nature as the vast sea gave her more room to accommodate movement. She was not as disturbed by the activity of the younger gods. She understood the change as part of creation. But even she became weary of their noise in time, though not at the same pace as Abzu. The myth describes a moment where Abzu's restlessness becomes too strong to ignore. He expresses his desire to quiet the younger gods permanently. This is the first sign that the early universe is shifting from natural movement into conflict. But the story does not judge him harshly. It treats him as a being overwhelmed by change he cannot adapt to. His discomfort is presented as an understandable, if misguided, response to a world that had grown beyond him. Abzu's plan, once formed, doesn't come with elaborate strategy. It reflects the same simplicity that had defined him from the start. He wanted to act directly. He wanted to reclaim the stillness. He didn't consider alternatives. He didn't seek compromise. He responded as the earliest forces often do, with a desire to return the world to a single state, not because he was cruel, but because he was ancient and rooted in an order that no longer existed. The younger gods remained unaware of this plan. They continued their movements, continued their sounds, continued their existence with the energy of beings who have only just begun to understand that they are alive. They had no memory of the world before them. They had no reason to believe their presence was creating tension. Their innocence wasn't a trait assigned by the storyteller. It was the natural condition of young existence. The myth does not rush toward the moment of confrontation. It allows the tension to grow slowly. Abzu's restlessness deepens. The younger gods continue their movements. Tiamat watches both sides, understanding the change but not yet willing to act. The story stays within this stage long enough for the reader to feel the slow build-up of pressure beneath the surface. This part of the myth reflects a deeper truth about the nature of beginnings. Change can overwhelm the foundations from which it arises. Forces that create the conditions for life may not be able to exist comfortably once that life expands. Stability and growth, though connected, do not always coexist peacefully. Abzu was both creator and foundation, yet the world that grew from him became too active for him to bear. When the ancient scribes described this moment, they were not trying to dramatize creation. They were trying to explain why the world shifts from calm to conflict. They understood that natural tension arises not from malice, but from differing natures. Things that were once aligned eventually find themselves diverging. Abzu's desire to silence the younger gods is the result of this divergence. His decision marks a turning point in the myth, but the story still moves at a slow, steady pace. It respects the weight of Abzu's history. It acknowledges the validity of his discomfort. It allows his choice to appear as a natural, if unfortunate, response to a world that has grown beyond its earliest conditions. As his plan takes shape, the world does not yet react. The younger gods remain unaware. Tiamat listens in silence, her reactions forming slowly. Abzu holds his decision within him like a deep current preparing to shift. The early universe stands in a state of quiet tension, not yet broken but no longer fully calm. Creation has reached a point where change is no longer gentle. Movement now challenges the foundation that once supported it. Abzu, the steady depth, has become restless. His choice will lead the story into a new phase, one where the younger gods will need to respond for the first time, but that moment is still ahead. For now, the deep gathers itself, preparing for a shift that will alter the early world and carry creation into the next stage of its unfolding path. When the deep had grown restless and Abzu's desire to silence the younger gods had taken shape, the early world entered a quiet moment of suspense. Nothing happened all at once. The myths stay in this heavy pause long enough to let the weight of Abzu's thoughts settle. He had existed in quiet for ages, and the world he now faced no longer resembled the one he had known. The energy of the younger gods had turned the once still waters into a restless environment. Abzu's patience, once vast, had begun to thin. His plan to erase the noise and restore stillness formed in a way that felt inevitable to him, even if it was tragic in its simplicity. But the story of creation was no longer carried by stillness alone. The younger gods, though unaware of the danger gathering beneath them, were not entirely without awareness. Among them was one who listened more closely, who noticed subtle changes in the tone of the deep, who understood the early universe with a kind of instinct the others had not developed. This was Enki, also called Ea in later traditions, the god who had become known for wisdom, cleverness, and the ability to shape events not through force, but through understanding. Enki's origins in the myths are deeply tied to the waters themselves. He was associated with freshwater, not in the way Abzu embodied it as the primordial deep, but in the way springs and flowing currents carried it forward into the world. If Abzu was the silent reservoir beneath everything, Enki was the expression of those waters in motion, life-bearing, clever, adaptive. His nature made him uniquely suited to sense the shift that was happening before the others noticed. The same currents that brought creation to life brought him awareness. The stories never suggest that Enki learned of Abzu's plan through confrontation or open conversation. Instead, his knowledge is portrayed as something intuitive. The younger gods had grown within the world without knowing what came before them, but Enki seemed to understand both the new energy of creation and the old stillness that had defined its earliest form. He recognized the tension between them. He sensed the growing heaviness in the deep, the way the waters beneath the world no longer rested comfortably, and he understood the danger before anyone else did. When Abzu confided his intentions to Tiamat, the ancient sea held the news with a slow, heavy reaction. She cared for her offspring, but she also understood the weariness of her partner. She did not want to harm her children, yet she also recognized the pressure growing within the deep. Her reaction was complicated, layered with the patience of a primordial being who had existed long before the younger gods were born. She neither encouraged nor prevented Abzu's plan. She remained suspended between two instincts, protectiveness and understanding. Enki, however, did not hesitate. The myths describe him as responding to the situation with clarity. He does not panic. He does not recoil. He simply recognizes that the course the deep was taking would end the world before it had truly begun. He knew that Abzu's desire to restore silence would bring the early universe back to a state too still to sustain life. The younger gods, energetic and unaware, were not prepared for such a threat. Enki understood that someone would need to act, but the way he chose to act is what makes this story unique. He did not gather forces. He did not rally the younger gods. He did not attempt to confront Abzu with strength or challenge him through force. Enki had no interest in direct conflict. His nature wasn't aligned with violence. He approached the unfolding crisis the way water approaches obstacles, by finding a path the obstacle doesn't notice until it is too late. The ancient texts describe his plan as secretive, carefully formed, and executed without drawing attention. His wisdom did not lie in prediction alone. It lay in his ability to move quietly in a world where quiet had almost disappeared. The younger gods continued their restless movements, unaware of the threat. Tiamat held her worry deep within her, not yet ready to choose sides. Abzu moved forward with a plan shaped by longing for stillness, and Enki stepped into the space between them with the calm confidence of someone who understood the shape of creation better than anyone else. The myths describe Enki constructing a chamber or sanctuary within which he could act. This sanctuary is sometimes portrayed as a ritual space, sometimes as a physical location, and sometimes simply as a metaphorical environment within the waters. What matters is that Enki created a place that Abzu could not sense, a hidden area where the deep could not perceive the movements within it. This sanctuary allowed him to prepare without alerting the very force he intended to stop. The moment Enki took action is described with the same steady detail that guides the rest of the myth. There is no dramatic build-up, no sudden shift in tone. He crafted a spell, an act that reflected his wisdom and his connection to the waters rather than force. This spell aimed to quiet the deep in a way the deep would not anticipate. Abzu had sought to silence his children, but Enki's plan would silence Abzu instead, not through violence, but through a clever reversal. The ancient texts say that Enki cast his spell upon Abzu while the primordial god slept. This detail carries a weight that makes sense within the myth. Abzu was not prepared for opposition. He did not expect his own children, who had created the noise disturbing him, to act against him. He had existed for ages without challenge. The deep had no concept of danger. Sleep for Abzu was not vulnerability. It was simply a return to the quiet he longed for. It was in this moment of stillness that Enki acted. The spell Enki cast subdued Abzu. It did not break him apart or destroy him in a violent sense. It transformed him. The myths say that Enki took Abzu's essence and built his temple upon it. Abzu became the foundation of Enki's domain, a source of fresh water that flowed through the world. This act reshaped the deep rather than eliminating it. The primordial waters didn't vanish. They became something broader, something integrated into the world rather than separate from it. Enki's plan succeeded because it aligned with the nature of creation. He did not try to stop water with force. He redirected it through a different shape. The restless depth could no longer threaten the younger gods. Instead, it continued to support the world through a gentler form. This transformation reflects the way Mesopotamian myths understood change. Forces are not removed, they are repurposed. The world is not cleansed of disruption. It is reshaped to incorporate it. The younger gods didn't celebrate in the way later stories might imagine. They didn't fully understand what had happened. They only sensed that the threat had passed. Their movements continued, their energy unhindered. They remained unaware that their survival had depended on a moment of quiet wisdom carried out by one of their own. Tiamat, however, felt the shift deeply. The myths describe her reaction as sorrowful. She had understood Abzu's struggle. She had not agreed with his plan, but she had sympathized with his discomfort in a world that had grown beyond its earliest form. The loss of Abzu's presence created a change within her that would become important in the next stage of the myth. But in this moment, the story still moves slowly. Her grief settles gently, the way waves settle after a storm, even if the depth beneath them has been altered. Enki, for his part, did not act with triumph. His plan was not about ambition or establishing authority. It was about preserving creation's momentum. He recognized that if the world was going to grow, it could not return to stillness. The early universe needed space to expand, and his actions created that space. His sanctuary became the new center of organization within the waters. The fresh currents he drew from Abzu's transformed essence became the streams that fed life. Enki became the god of wisdom, craft, and water, not because he sought the title, but because his actions shaped the world in a way that naturally aligned with these domains. The transformation of Abzu is sometimes misunderstood as destruction, but the myths never present it that way. Abzu becomes part of the world rather than a separate presence beneath it. Enki's triumph is not about defeating an enemy. It's about turning danger into structure. The deep, once restless, becomes a source of fresh water that supports creation. This transformation reflects the broader mythic theme of integration. Disorder is not removed, it is rearranged until it becomes useful. Enki's wisdom in this moment becomes clear. He understood that the first forces of creation could not be erased without destabilizing the world. Everything that arose from the primordial waters was connected. So instead of eliminating Abzu, he redefined him. He turned the restless deep into the very resource that would keep life flourishing. The younger gods could continue their movements without threatening the foundation of the world, because the foundation had been reshaped to support them. This episode in the myth establishes Enki as a figure who understands creation better than any other god. He is not the strongest, not the oldest, not the loudest, but he knows how to move through the world in a way that resembles water. Quiet, adaptable, clever. His plan doesn't rely on overwhelming force, but on recognizing the natural flow of things and adjusting it with subtle guidance. The ancient Mesopotamians saw wisdom not as a distant intellectual trait, but as the ability to understand the patterns of the world and work within them. Enki embodied this. His approach to the crisis created a new stability without destroying the forces that had shaped the early universe. Even Tiamat, though she grieved, understood that the world had changed in a way that could not be undone. This change, however, carried consequences. The younger gods now lived in a world shaped by Enki's intervention. Their presence continued to grow. Their activity increased. The universe moved into a more dynamic phase. And Tiamat, who had lost her partner, began to hold a growing tension within her own waters. Her grief did not turn to anger immediately, but the seeds of that future shift were present. For now, the myth remains in the aftermath of Enki's secret plan. The world is no longer threatened by Abzu's longing for stillness. The foundation beneath creation has been reshaped. Enki has become the quiet center of wisdom within the early universe, and the younger gods continue to move, unaware that their world now depends on the clever action of one among them. Creation has entered a new phase. The waters have been reorganized. The deep has been transformed. But the story continues, preparing for the next shift, as the early universe adjusts once more to the consequences of its own unfolding path. When Enki's plan had settled into its quiet conclusion, and Abzu's restless desire for stillness had been redirected into a new form, the early universe shifted into a state it had never known before. The primordial deep, the very foundation of creation, did not simply disappear. The myths do not describe its end with finality or destruction. Instead, they speak of sleep, an endless, unbroken slumber that folded the first god of the deep into a quieter existence than even the earliest world had known. Abzu's sleep was not a simple detail in the narrative. It wasn't a poetic flourish chosen by later storytellers. It was the ancient way of explaining how something so fundamental could remain present in the world without continuing to act within it. The deep still existed. The fresh waters beneath the earth still flowed. Springs still rose. Rivers still gained strength from unseen sources. But the consciousness that had once been tied to those waters no longer stirred. Abzu had become a presence without motion, without intention, without awareness. His sleep was not rest, it was transformation. To the ancient scribes, this idea made sense. They understood water as something that could hold layers of existence. A marsh could be active on the surface but calm below. A river could be turbulent while its depths remained quiet. Wells could tap into reservoirs that never rushed or rose. The world beneath the land was full of places where water existed in stillness. They didn't imagine these places as empty. They imagined them as sleeping. So when they described the primordial god entering eternal slumber, they weren't imagining a figure lying down. They were describing a shift in the nature of the world. Abzu continued to exist, but he no longer shaped creation. He no longer reacted to the noise of the younger gods. He no longer longed for stillness or felt overwhelmed by the growing activity. He became part of the world in a passive way, a quiet foundation that supported existence without influencing it. Enki's sanctuary, built upon Abzu's subdued form, served as the first example of how ancient myth could transform a cosmic shift into something practical. The deep was no longer a restless force. It had become the source of water used by the gods and the world alike. The primordial presence that had once threatened to erase creation now fed the rivers, nourished the soil, and sustained the early universe. This transformation wasn't framed as punishment. It wasn't framed as exile. It was framed as an outcome that allowed creation to move forward without losing its foundation. The ancient myths did not attempt to soften Abzu's fate with reassurance. They didn't suggest he would wake again. They didn't offer a prophecy or a condition for his return. Once he slept, he remained asleep. This permanence reflected the nature of the change. The early universe had passed a threshold, and the threshold could not be crossed backward. Once creation had entered a world of movement, it could not return to silence. Abzu's sleep symbolized the acceptance of this new reality. The idea of a god sleeping forever may sound symbolic to modern readers, but to ancient Mesopotamians, it was a deeply practical explanation for how the world worked. The fresh waters beneath the earth were always present, always steady, always life-giving, yet never shifting with the same unpredictability as the rivers or seas. They behaved like something at rest, something that had once been alive with motion but had settled into a long, unbroken pause. This was how they understood the deep. It slept, and in that sleep, it continued to hold the world together. The younger gods never spoke to Abzu again in the myths. They never tried to wake him. They never sought reconciliation. They continued their lives in a world where the foundation beneath them had been stabilized by Enki's intervention. Their existence carried forward on currents shaped by Abzu's transformed role. They were not ungrateful. They were simply unaware. The idea of a primordial presence sleeping beneath creation was not something they needed to dwell on. Their lives were shaped by movement, by sound, by the energy of a world waking from stillness. The story of Abzu's slumber also reflected an older recognition that some parts of the world are too fundamental to vanish, but too ancient to participate in new developments. The deep had been the earliest environment, the first condition of existence, But creation had outgrown that stage. Once life began, stillness could not continue to dominate. Movement needed space, growth needed room, complexity needed a world that changed. The myths portray Abzu's sleep as an act that stabilized the universe. A restless primordial force could not coexist with the younger gods forever. His sleep allowed everything else to exist without the threat of being pulled back into stillness. The deep that had once threatened to silence creation now silently supported it. When ancient people gathered around water, they understood the presence of something old beneath it. Wells tapped into ancient reservoirs that had stored water for centuries. Springs emerged from unseen depths with remarkable consistency. These sources of water were steady, reliable, and quiet. They behaved like something that slept beneath the world. The idea that Abzu slept forever wasn't abstract. It reflected the lived experience of people who depended on underground water for life. Abzu's slumber also carried an emotional weight within the myth, though the texts never describe it in sentimental terms. He had once been the foundation of creation. He had once carried the calm that defined the earliest world. And now he slept beneath everything, a presence without voice or motion. His rest was heavy, not gentle. It didn't resemble the sleep of mortals. It resembled the stillness of an era that had passed. Tiamat felt the shift more deeply than anyone else. Her grief, described in the next stages of the myth, arose from the loss of her partner in creation. She had existed with Abzu when the world was still young and simple. She had known the calm of the earliest waters. She had watched creation stir and grow. She understood both the beauty of movement and the price that movement carried. Abzu's sleep was, for her, not just the end of his agitation. It was the end of the world they had shared before the younger gods existed. Her sorrow wasn't immediate rage. It wasn't vengeance waiting to erupt. It was a slow, heavy ache that settled into the saltwater sea. The world moved on, but she held the memory of a time before movement, before sound, before change. And that memory would eventually transform into something else, something that would reshape the mythic world again. But for now, the myth rests with Abzu's slumber. It stays in this quiet moment long enough to understand its significance. The deep no longer acts, it no longer responds. It is present, but unreachable. Its influence flows through the world without shaping it consciously. This shift created stability, but it also created a space where new forces could rise without the oversight of the oldest presence. Creation, in this moment, feels balanced between loss and opportunity. The world gained motion, but it lost the calm that had defined its earliest existence. The younger gods gained space to grow, but they lost their connection to the first order of creation. Tiamat gained freedom from the tension that had grown with Abzu's unrest, but she lost the partner who had existed beside her since the beginning of time. And Enki, whose wisdom shaped this transformation, gained a role that would bind him forever to the deep. His sanctuary rested upon Abzu's slumber. His domain flowed through the transformed waters. His responsibility expanded with the changes he'd made. The wisdom that allowed him to outwit the ancient sea now tied him to the foundation of creation. The world continued to grow. The younger gods continued to move. Creation found new patterns, new rhythms, new forms. But beneath it all, a presence slept. A primordial force that no longer stirred, but remained as part of the world's hidden foundation. The myths leave Abzu in this state permanently. There is no prophecy of awakening, no hidden future in which he rises again. His sleep becomes the condition of the deep itself. The underground waters that fed the world were described as the Abzu, not in memory of a god who might return, but as the natural extension of a god whose essence had become the world's structure. The slumber of Abzu marked the point where creation permanently shifted from primordial simplicity to divine complexity. From this moment forward, the story no longer centers on calm waters or ancient depths. It centers on movement, actions, choices, and consequences. It centers on gods who shape the world rather than embodying it. It centers on the dynamics of existence after the deep has fallen silent. But the deep remains. It sleeps without dreaming, without waking, without changing. It holds the weight of the early world and the memory of creation's first form. And while the younger gods rise into roles marked by motion and conflict, Abzu remains the quiet foundation beneath everything, shaping the world not through intention, but through the steady presence of a god who once existed at the beginning of all things. Creation continues from here, carried by the consequences of this transformation, and the story moves gently into the next stage, where the vast saltwater sea will slowly feel the full weight of what has changed. When the earliest chapters of creation had unfolded and Abzu slipped into his long unbroken sleep, the world kept moving forward. The younger gods continued shaping the universe with a kind of persistent energy that never seemed to fade. Tiamat carried her quiet grief. Enki tended to the deep in its transformed state, and creation, now filled with motion and complexity, began its gradual shift toward the human world, towards cities, agriculture, canals, and the first attempts to understand life through memory rather than instinct. The stories that once existed only among gods and primordial waters began to settle into the minds of people who carved their thoughts onto clay. Long after the primordial events themselves had passed from cosmic action into mythic memory, the presence of Abzu remained, not as a loud god, not as a moving force, and not as a being who interfered in human affairs. Instead, he remained as part of the world's structure, a quiet certainty beneath everything, the source of fresh water, the unseen well beneath the soil, the reservoir that fed rivers and canals. Humans didn't imagine him as watching them. They imagined him as supporting them. For ancient Mesopotamians, remembering Abzu meant remembering the deep. They didn't picture him as a slumbering figure in a distant realm. They pictured him wherever fresh water gathered beneath the earth's surface, wherever springs rose from unseen layers, wherever wells reached down into clean, cold darkness. Abzu became less of a character and more of a landscape. And because the landscape defined survival, his memory became central to some of the most important structures in Mesopotamian life. Temples. Temples in ancient Mesopotamia were not only places of prayer, they were monumental centres of culture, administration, agriculture and identity. They stored grain, managed irrigation, held archives, regulated trade, and acted as anchors for communities. And within these grand structures, the ziggurats, the sanctuaries, the courtyards, there was nearly always a designated space meant to represent the realm of Abzu. It was not a symbolic gesture, it was a practical daily acknowledgement of the force that sustained the world. This space was often a pool of fresh water, kept clean, quiet, and carefully maintained. Sometimes it was a well, sometimes it was a small basin carved into stone. In later periods, it became an elaborate sacred installation. Regardless of form, the purpose was the same. It stood as the earthly equivalent of the primordial deep, the Abzu beneath the world. Priests tended these waters with reverence and routine care. They understood that without the deep, nothing else could thrive. These temple waters weren't treated as magical. They weren't believed to contain supernatural properties. They were treated as essential, steady, and sacred in the calmest sense of the word. Their presence reminded people that the world had an underlying structure older than the sky, older than the land, older even than the gods who now dominated mythic stories. The deep came first. The deep remained, and through the waters maintained in the temples, the deep continued to support life. The myth of Abzu's slumber gave meaning to this presence. It explained why the waters beneath the earth never acted unpredictably, why they never rose with storms, why they remained consistent even when the world above them changed. Abzu's rest was a way of understanding the reliability of groundwater. As long as the deep slept, life remained possible. As long as the temple pools remained calm, the world retained its balance. Enki's role in the transformation of Abzu was remembered in these temples as well. Many sanctuaries dedicated to Enki, especially those in Eridu, one of the oldest cities in Mesopotamia, featured a sacred pool called the Abzu. This wasn't a symbolic name chosen for poetic effect. It reflected an understanding that Enki's power flowed from the deep he had reshaped. The pool in his temple represented the transformed Abzu itself. Priests believed that the god's wisdom, creativity, and guidance rose from this place. The temple at Eridu, known in later texts as the Abzu or House of the Abzu, was among the oldest religious structures known to the region. It existed as a physical reminder of ancient myths long before they were fully written down. The people of Eridu believed their city was the first place where the gods descended to the land. They believed it was where the world began to organize itself, and at the center of this city stood the sanctuary of Enki, connected to the deep both in myth and in daily ritual. The sacred pool in Enki's temple wasn't merely decorative. It represented the ongoing presence of the deep within the world. The myths may have described Abzu sleeping forever, but humans interpreted this sleep as a constant, diligent stillness that they had to preserve. Maintaining the water in these sacred pools was a ritual task requiring both care and precision. It reflected the belief that creation itself remained stable only if the deep was tended with respect. These temple pools also served another purpose. They connected the idea of remembrance to the daily act of survival. Fresh water was not guaranteed in the ancient world. It needed to be managed, controlled, and protected. Wells had to be dug. Irrigation canals had to be maintained. Flooding had to be monitored. By caring for the water in the temples, the people mirrored the cosmic act that allowed creation to continue. They remembered Abzu not just as a mythic figure but as a force woven into every practical aspect of life. As Mesopotamian cities grew and civilizations expanded, the relationship between water and religion deepened. Temples became places where memory and utility overlapped. The sacred waters were part of purification rituals. Priests washed their hands in them before approaching the inner chambers. Water was used to cleanse objects, tools, and offerings. It was considered the element that allowed humans to approach the divine without bringing impurity into sacred spaces. This wasn't because water was magical in a supernatural sense, but because it was associated with origins, stability, and the unbroken foundation beneath everything. Abzu's memory lived in these rituals, even if his name was not invoked frequently. People didn't address him directly. They didn't pray to him for protection or intervention. They acknowledged him through the water itself. The act of keeping fresh water within temple walls was a form of silent devotion. The deep had shaped the world. The people honoured that by shaping their temples around his presence. Over time, different cities developed their own versions of sacred water spaces. Some built miniature canals within temple courtyards. Some created underground chambers that captured fresh water from natural springs. Some constructed elaborate pools lined with stone and connected to larger water systems. In all these variations, the central idea remained unchanged. The deep needed to be acknowledged, preserved, and woven into the life of the community. This connection extended beyond ritual. It influenced architecture. Temples were built with drainage systems designed to channel water toward the sacred pools. They were constructed in ways that reflected the flow of water through the land. Some ziggurats were even designed to resemble mountains rising from the waters, though the imagery changed over different periods and regions. The presence of water in sacred architecture was not decoration, it was foundational. Even kings participated in this remembrance. Royal inscriptions often described rulers as caretakers of the deep. They claimed to maintain canals, dig wells, and protect water sources in ways that preserved the order of the world. These acts were framed as responsibilities to the gods, especially to Enki. Caring for water meant caring for the structure that creation rested upon, and by extension, it meant honouring Abzu. Through this, Abzu's memory survived even though he no longer acted within the mythic stories. His role as a primordial force endured through ritual, architecture, governance, and daily survival. The deep remained the source of life, and the people returned to it constantly, whether through temple rituals or through the simple act of drawing water from a well. It's easy to imagine these temple pools as quiet moments within busy cities. The sound of voices and tools faded as one approached the inner sanctuaries. The air cooled. The stone walls blocked the heat. The water in the pool sat still, reflecting only the faintest movements. This stillness wasn't symbolic of calm. It was calm. It was the physical reminder of the earliest universe, a world before noise, before motion, before the younger gods filled creation with their restless energy. Even though the myths described Abzu sleeping forever, these pools were not treated as reminders of loss. They were reminders of foundation. They signified that even as the world changed, as new gods rose, as cities grew, the deep remained beneath it all. It had become part of the earth itself. It supported everything without needing to move. In this way, the temples kept Abzu alive within memory. They honoured him not through stories of his personality, but through their acknowledgement of the force he represented. The deep was old, the deep was necessary, the deep was steady. It did not need to act to be important. It needed only to exist. Humans understood this in a direct, practical way. Their lives depended on the deep. Their crops depended on it. Their survival depended on it. And so their temples incorporated it into their rituals, making the deep not just something remembered, but something experienced. The world of the gods continued to unfold, with stories of conflict, creation, power, and wisdom. But the presence of Abzu remained the quiet undercurrent beneath all of it. As the mythic narrative moved forward into new complexities, as Tiamat's sorrow deepened, and the younger gods assumed greater roles, the temple waters held their calm, reflecting the earliest world within their surface. The deep stayed where it had always been, unchanged in its nature, even as creation itself shifted around it. And from these temple pools, the memory of Abzu continued, carried forward by the people who lived above the hidden reservoir that had once been the first god of the fresh waters. Creation had moved far from its earliest form, but the deep remained, and the temples that held its reflection allowed that memory to stay alive, quiet and steady, ready to follow the story into its next unfolding step. As Mesopotamian civilization continued to grow beyond its earliest myths, the memory of Abzu did not fade with distance or time, it simply changed form. The primordial deep was no longer the restless force that had once tried to restore the world to silence. He was no longer the first presence to feel the pressure of creation's movement. He had become something quieter, steadier, and more integrated into the world itself. His slumber beneath creation was woven into the way ancient people understood the land, the rivers, the wells, and the lakes that sustained their lives. Through water, the memory of the earliest ocean found new expression in places far from the cosmic stories of gods. Even without directly invoking Abzu's name, people lived every day in a landscape shaped by the deep. They drew water from wells that reached down into hidden reservoirs. They walked along riverbanks that carried fresh water from sources they never saw. They tended fields irrigated through canals that traced paths older than their cities. They stood beside marshes, lakes, and springs that rose unexpectedly from the earth. And in each of these places the presence of the primordial deep lingered. The people of Mesopotamia lived in a region defined by water's behaviour, its generosity and its unpredictability. Water made settlements possible. It turned barren soil into farmland. It created pathways of trade. It shaped borders and seasons. But it also carried risks. Floods could destroy crops. Droughts could threaten cities. Rivers could shift their courses without warning. The ancient people understood that water was both life-giving and powerful in ways they could not control. It made sense to them that a primordial being lay beneath it all. Rivers were the most visible reminder of this connection. The Tigris and Euphrates were not simply waterways. They were the lifelines of the region. Their annual flooding cycles deposited fertile soil across the fields, making agriculture possible. Their vast networks of tributaries linked cities together. They carried fish, reeds, silt, and the resources needed for daily survival. They created marshlands that hosted rich ecosystems, from birds to fish to aquatic plants. In these marshlands, fresh and salt water sometimes met, creating the same blend that had shaped the mythic world of Abzu and Tiamat. To the ancient mind, the behaviour of rivers was not entirely natural. It held memory. It carried hints of something older. The fresh water that flowed through them came from sources hidden beneath the world. Those sources were connected to the deep. Even though people understood rivers in practical terms, they also saw them as surfaces that concealed mysteries. The riverbeds themselves demonstrated this duality. In times of drought, the waters would retreat, revealing dry channels that were usually hidden beneath the flowing currents. These dried channels felt ancient, as if they were reminders of a time when water had not yet begun its cycle. People could walk across these exposed pathways and feel as if they were stepping into a space that connected them to the deep beneath the surface. In times of flood, those same channels would vanish again beneath rapidly rising waters, as if the deep was stirring. Rivers also created boundaries between worlds, between city and field, between marshlands and dry land, between what people could control and what lay beyond their grasp. These boundaries reinforced the understanding that water existed in layers. The surface waters were accessible, the deeper waters were hidden, the primordial waters were unreachable, yet felt everywhere. The rivers were the visible part of a system that stretched down into the unseen, and in that unseen space, Abzu slept. Wells provided a more direct connection to the hidden deep. Digging a well was an act that physically bridged the human world with the sleeping waters beneath it. Each stone lowered into the well shaft, each bucket of soil lifted out, brought people closer to the unseen layers of the earth. When fresh water finally appeared at the bottom of the shaft, it was treated with a kind of quiet respect. This was not surface water. This was water drawn from the deep. It came from a place humans could not reach without tools and effort. It came from a place older than memory. The moment when a well first fills with water has a quiet weight to it. Even today it feels like uncovering a hidden secret. For ancient people, it was more than a discovery. It was a reminder of the world beneath the world, the place where Abzu slept. Wells were often built with stone linings and carefully carved rims. These were not mere functional structures, they were gateways. They allowed life to rise from the depths and enter the world of humans. In some regions, wells were considered too sacred to be used casually. People approached them with care. They drew water in measured amounts. They maintained the stonework meticulously. They understood that if a well collapsed or dried, it wasn't simply an inconvenience. It meant the connection to the deep had been disturbed. This belief created a culture of maintenance around wells that lasted for centuries. The work of preserving these structures became a form of honouring the deep, even if the myths behind it were never spoken aloud during daily life. Sacred lakes added another layer to this connection. These bodies of water were often calmer than rivers, more contained than marshes, and more approachable than the open sea. They were places where the reflection of the sky met the surface of the earth. Lakes did not reveal their origins easily. Some formed naturally from geological shifts. Others formed where river channels changed. Some seemed to appear without warning after storms or floods. To ancient observers, lakes were mysterious in ways rivers were not. Rivers travelled, lakes stayed. Their stillness resembled the slumber of Abzu. Their depth hinted at unseen layers, and their isolation made them feel like places where the boundaries between worlds were thinner. It wasn't unusual for lakes to be associated with spirits, deities, or ancient forces. Even when these associations weren't written in the same terms as the Abzu myth, the sentiment was similar. Something old lingered beneath their surfaces. The water drawn from lakes was often used in purification rituals. Priesthoods associated certain lakes with divine presence, not because of dramatic myths, but because of their stillness, clarity, or depth. Lakes that never dried were especially revered. They were seen as tied to something ancient and stable. Lakes that fluctuated dramatically with the seasons were treated with caution, as if they reflected the shifting moods of forces beneath the world. Canals, too, became part of this story. They were artificial rivers, created by human hands but filled with water drawn from the deep through rivers, wells, or marshlands. The work of maintaining canals was essential to life. If canals dried, fields failed. If canals overflowed, homes flooded. Building and maintaining these channels was seen as an act of partnership with the forces of water. The deep supplied the water, but humans guided it. This partnership reflected a broader understanding. Humans could work with the deep, but they could not control it. They could shape the flow of rivers through canals, but they could not change the river's behaviour. They could dig wells, but they could not create the water. They could build lakes by blocking channels or creating reservoirs, but they could not invent the source of those waters. All water came from somewhere older, somewhere beneath the surface, somewhere connected to the primordial deep. This understanding became part of everyday life. People moved with the rhythms of water. They planted crops when the rivers receded. They gathered reeds in the marshlands. They dug canals in the dry season. They drew water in the morning before the sun grew too hot, and even if they didn't speak Abzu's name, they lived with his presence constantly. The deep shaped their world, not through active godly intervention, but through the steady flow of water that kept their civilization alive. The presence of water also shaped mythology in ways that extended beyond temples. Many myths featured gods associated with rivers, storms, lakes, or springs. These gods acted in the world through movement and emotion. They brought rain, floods, or drought. They were invoked in times of need or fear. But beneath all these active forces, the memory of Abzu remained like a quiet baseline. The deep had no storms, the deep had no waves. It slept beneath everything, providing the fresh water that made all other divine actions relevant. This layered view of water, surface chaos, mid-level flow, deep stillness, was reflected in the stories people told, the rituals they performed, and the way they organized their cities. The deep was the one part of the water cycle that never changed. Rain came and went, rivers rose and fell, lakes dried and refilled, canals shifted with human work, but the deep remained. The memory of Abzu also influenced how people understood death. The underworld lay beneath the surface, not in a distant sky or across an unreachable sea. The deep was the first layer of what lay below. People buried their dead beneath the earth with the understanding that they were sending them toward the place where the primordial deep slept. The underworld was separate from Abzu's domain, but the spatial connection mattered. The deep was the first environment beneath the world. Everything else lay beyond it. This created a quiet connection between memory, ritual, and landscape. People lived above the deep. They drew life from it. They sent their dead toward it. They built temples to honor it. They shaped their understanding of creation around it. And through rivers, wells, and sacred lakes, they remained in constant contact with a force older than the gods who governed their daily lives. The deep was not worshipped. It was understood, and that understanding shaped society in ways more subtle than any temple hymn or carved inscription. Farmers knew the deep when their wells filled. Fishermen knew it when marshlands thrived. Priests knew it when sacred pools reflected the glow of torches. Kings knew it when they ordered new canals to be dug. Everyone knew it when droughts reminded them of their dependence on waters that could not be commanded. Through all of this, the memory of Abzu continued, quietly, steadily, and without interruption. It flowed beneath the world, beneath the stories, beneath the rituals, beneath the cities. And as the mythic narrative prepared to shift once more toward gods, who acted with force and emotion, the deep remained the silent foundation, reflecting creation's earlier state through every river, every well, and every lake that carried its presence into the lives of those who depended on it. The world had grown far beyond its primordial beginning, yet the deep never left. and through the waters that sustained life, the memory of the first ocean lingered, ready to accompany the next part of the unfolding story. As the world moved far beyond the first waters and the earlier stories fell into the long rhythm of human memory, people continued to live beside rivers, draw from wells, and build their homes near marshes and lakes without thinking about how old those waters truly were. Thousands of years after scribes first pressed the name Abzu into wet clay, new voices entered the conversation. Scholars, excavators, linguists, skeptics, archaeologists, and careful thinkers who tried to understand what the ancient storytellers really meant. These people were not trying to revive myth. They were trying to place it within history. They wanted to trace a line from the earlier stories of the deep to the world that produced them. The search for a historical Abzu was never about proving that he had once walked or spoken or ruled over ancient waters. Scholars approached the idea differently. They asked what the deep meant to the people who created the myth. They looked at geography, climate, agriculture, hydrology, politics, writing systems, and the long evolution of ritual. They tried to understand why the earliest Mesopotamians felt compelled to give the deep a name, and why that name survived long after the cosmic story around it had shifted. The first clue came from the landscape itself. Mesopotamia was shaped by water in a way few regions were. The land sat between two rivers that defined every part of life. The plains were fertile only when those rivers behaved. The climate was harsh enough that without irrigation, cities could not survive. Marshlands spread across the southern region, creating an environment where fresh and salt water mixed in patterns that changed with the seasons. Underneath it all lay a network of aquifers feeding wells and springs that provided fresh water even when the rivers shrank. To scholars, this environment created the perfect conditions for the idea of a primordial deep. People who live in landscapes shaped by water tend to see water as a cosmic presence, not just a physical resource. And in a world before modern hydrology, the deep was both a mystery and a necessity. It was a natural step for ancient people to imagine that the unseen source of all fresh water, the groundwater beneath their feet, was older than any other part of the world. This early understanding led many researchers to see Abzu not as an invented character, but as a personification of something deeply practical. The deep was the environment that allowed civilization to exist. Naming it gave people a way to speak about it, honour it, and understand it. Others pointed to linguistic clues. The word Abzu existed long before the stories about Abzu the god took shape. It may have originally meant something like deep water or underground reservoir, later expanding to include mythic meaning. This progression wasn't unusual. Many ancient deities began as descriptions of natural forces rather than personalities. Over time, these forces were woven into stories, given roles, and reshaped into divine figures who fit the emerging mythic framework. This evolutionary pattern suggests that Abzu didn't begin as a figure in a story. He began as a word. The story followed. But the search for a historical origin doesn't end there. Scholars continue to analyse how Abzu appears across different periods, regions and languages. In some texts, he is the deep itself. In others, he is a being sleeping within it. In still others, he becomes the name of a section of a temple, a sacred pool, or the fresh water used in purification rituals. Each of these variations reflects a different relationship between people and water. None of them contradict the others. They demonstrate how the same idea can take different forms in different eras. Skeptics, on the other hand, often approach the story from another angle. They ask whether Abzu was ever meant to be understood as a literal being at all. They argue that early myths weren't meant to be literal accounts of cosmic events, but frameworks for understanding natural phenomena. They point out that the mythic language of ancient texts often blends metaphor, symbol, and observation without distinguishing between them. Abzu, they suggest, was not a god who once existed, but a poetic way of explaining a world shaped by water. But even skeptics acknowledge that something deeper exists within the myth. They recognise that ancient people did not draw strict lines between myth and knowledge. For them, describing the deep as a sleeping god was not metaphorical. It was how they understood the world. It provided meaning, structure, and emotional depth to the environment they depended on. Scholars and skeptics may disagree on the literal nature of Abzu, but both groups recognise that the idea reflects something profound about how early civilizations perceived their landscape. Archaeologists provide another perspective, grounded in physical evidence. Excavations at sites like Eridu, and Nippur reveal the deliberate placement of water-related structures within temple complexes. Sacred pools, channels, wells, and basins appear in the earliest layers of these sites. These installations were not decorative. They were integral to ritual, purification, and the daily functions of the temple. In Eridu, the Temple of Enki was built around a pool symbolizing the Abzu. The structure went through many phases of rebuilding, but the pool remained central. Archaeologists see this as a concrete example of a mythic idea made physical. The people of Eridu believed they were maintaining the deep within the temple, keeping it calm, clean, and stable so the world beyond it could remain balanced. This physical evidence supports the idea that Abzu was more than a character from a story. He was a concept that lived within the architecture, rituals, and water management practices of early cities. The deep shaped the way temples were built and the way people approached the divine. Some scholars take this further and argue that the mythic deep served as a model for the organization of society. Just as the deep supported the world quietly and steadily, the temple supported the community. Just as the waters beneath the earth held everything together, the rituals within the temple held society together. This symbolic mirroring reinforces the idea that Abzu wasn't simply a mythic being, but a framework for thinking about order, stability, and foundation. But not all interpretations focus on symbolism. Some researchers take a more scientific approach, suggesting that the myth reflects geological observations. Southern Mesopotamia was prone to subsidence, the gradual sinking of the land. When ground levels shifted, wells sometimes filled unexpectedly, while others dried out. Springs appeared, disappeared, and reappeared in new places. The ground itself felt alive. It made sense to ancient people that forces beneath the surface were active, even if those forces worked slowly. A sleeping god beneath the world aligned neatly with what they saw and felt. Skeptics counter by saying that the myth reflects universal story patterns rather than local geology. They point to the idea of primordial waters appearing in many cultures: the Egyptian Nun, the Greek Okeanos, the Hebrew Tehom, the Babylonian Tiamat. They argue that the deep is a near-universal symbol for pre-creation, not a literal memory of groundwater. But this doesn't diminish Abzu's significance. It places him within a wider human pattern, one shared across civilizations that saw water as the first and most fundamental element of existence. Linguists add another layer, analysing how the name Abzu appears in different texts across centuries. They note how scribes sometimes use the word to describe literal water features, sometimes to describe cosmic domains, and sometimes to refer to the temple pools. This flexibility suggests that ancient people did not separate the physical and the divine. The deep beneath the earth and the primordial god were part of the same concept. Modern interpretations wrestle with this blending. Scholars want to categorize, skeptics want to clarify, archaeologists want to trace physical evidence, linguists want to map the evolution of language. But the ancient world did not draw these distinctions. The deep was the deep. It was physical, conceptual, divine, and practical at the same time. Even in later periods, when new religions rose and old myths faded, the idea of the deep persisted. The underworld in many Mesopotamian texts lies beneath the waters of the Abzu. Rituals continued to use fresh water for purification. The temple pools remained central features of religious life. The deep remained the first layer beneath the world, the place life came from and the place where it ended. Scholars studying these continuities see Abzu not as an isolated figure but as part of a long cultural memory. Some researchers argue that Abzu's longevity reflects a human need for a stable foundational concept. Civilizations change, dynasties rise and fall, myths evolve, but the deep remains constant. People needed something beneath the world that didn't shift, something they could rely on even if they didn't understand it. Abzu provided that certainty, not as an active god, but as a presence woven into the structure of existence. Skeptics, even when challenging literal interpretations, often acknowledge that the emotional and cultural weight of the deep is as important as its historical accuracy. They point out that myths endure not because they are factual, but because they express truths that facts alone cannot explain. The deep expressed the ancient understanding of survival, dependency, and the quiet forces that shape a world without asking for recognition. The search for a historical Abzu doesn't reveal a single definitive answer. Instead, it reveals layers: hydrological, linguistic, geographic, ritualistic, symbolic, architectural, and psychological. Each layer contributes to an understanding of why the deep mattered so much to the people who first named it. Scholars and skeptics, despite their different approaches, both recognize that the myth reflects something grounded in real experience. Abzu may not have walked or spoken in history, but the world that produced him was shaped by a deep so essential that people needed a way to understand it. Myth gave them that tool. The deep became a presence, a sleep, a domain, a memory, a temple pool, a word carved repeatedly into clay. And the search for a historical Abzu is, in the end, a search for the earliest human attempts to understand the forces that sustain life. As the story continues, the focus shifts from the quiet memory of the deep to the broader implications of what creation meant to ancient people. The intersection of myth and science, the blending of memory and measurement, and the long path that leads from primordial waters to human understanding. As the myths surrounding Abzu settled into the long memory of the ancient world, people continued to live their lives beside the same rivers, wells, and reservoirs that had shaped their earlier stories. The myths persisted, but so did questions, quiet ones, unspoken at first, carried more by experience than by language. Over time, the people who studied the land, watched the behaviour of the rivers, and examined the long patterns of seasons began to notice something that earlier storytellers had already expressed without using the word science. The deep behaved predictably. The waters beneath the earth moved with purpose. The world operated according to patterns that could be learned rather than guessed. And these observations, though thousands of years removed from modern research, reflected a level of understanding woven into the myth itself. The creation story of Abzu wasn't framed like an early scientific theory, but it held within it a set of observations that made sense for a civilization built on irrigation and agriculture. The idea of a hidden reservoir beneath the earth wasn't invented purely from imagination. It reflected what people saw when they dug wells, when rivers receded, when springs emerged unexpectedly, and when entire marshlands remained wet even after months without visible rainfall. The myth of the deep preserved these observations in a narrative form that was easier to carry forward than technical instruction. People remembered stories more easily than they remembered mechanisms. Over generations, these stories turned into something broader, a cultural memory that helped people navigate a landscape where water determined everything. The idea that fresh water came from a hidden ancient source beneath the earth aligned closely with what modern hydrology now understands as aquifers and groundwater systems. Of course, ancient people didn't use these terms, they didn't map water tables or measure permeability, but they recognized, through repeated experience, that fresh water existed in layers, that it could be accessed through digging, and that it flowed in ways that didn't always match what the surface suggested. This connection between myth and natural observation created a kind of early scientific intuition. People didn't need complex theories to understand that water travelled underground. They learned it by watching wells refill after rainfall, by noticing that some springs ran year-round while others dried up, and by observing how certain soils soaked up water while others resisted it. These experiences weren't separated into categories of myth, and study. They existed together. Ancestors passed down their understanding through stories that held both memory and meaning. The myth of Abzu sleeping beneath the earth mirrored this understanding. A sleeping god wasn't a loud explanation. It was quiet, steady, and consistent. And it captured the idea that something important lay hidden below the surface. Something that didn't act aggressively, something that didn't shift quickly, something that influenced the world through presence rather than movement. This description matched the behaviour of groundwater. Ancient people saw wells fill slowly, springs bubble consistently, and marshes remain active regardless of surface conditions. They knew the deep was reliable. They described it through myth because myth was how they framed reality. As scholars later examined these myths, they found that many early civilizations expressed their knowledge of natural systems in similar ways. They noticed patterns that matched what scientists now understand about hydrology, geology, and ecology. The deep waters of Mesopotamia behaved according to natural laws, and the myths surrounding them preserved those laws in narrative form. The idea of a primordial ocean beneath the earth wasn't a mistake. It was a way of describing an observation using the language available at the time. The science hidden in these ancient waters didn't stop with groundwater. The behaviour of rivers also reflected an early understanding of natural cycles. The Tigris and Euphrates rose and fell according to the melting of distant snow in the mountains to the north. People saw this annually. They connected the flooding with the agricultural cycle. They learned which areas would be enriched by silt deposits, and which areas would need additional irrigation. Their calendars were shaped by the behaviour of water. Their measurements of time were influenced by cycles they never fully controlled. The mythic framework didn't separate these experiences into categories. The movement of rivers was part of the world the gods shaped. The flooding was an event that reflected the balance or imbalance between divine forces. But at the same time, farmers knew that the soil became fertile after the floods. They knew which months brought the rising waters. They understood how to build canals to guide the flow. They learned the science beneath the story, even if they never called it science. This blending of observation and myth created a world in which stories carried practical value. The memory of Abzu sleeping beneath the earth reminded people that water was precious, stable, and foundational. It encouraged them to treat wells with respect, to protect springs, and to manage water sources carefully. It wasn't a superstition. It was a cultural heritage shaped by practical necessity. Over centuries, different cities developed ways to integrate water into their rituals. These rituals often preserved knowledge in symbolic form. For example, the use of water for purification wasn't simply spiritual. It was rooted in the practical understanding that clean water prevented illness. People may not have known about microscopic organisms or contamination, but they knew that fresh, flowing water kept them healthier than stagnant pools. Ritual washing before entering a temple ensured hygiene in spaces where large numbers of people gathered. The symbolic act had a practical foundation. The temple pools that represented the Abzu were maintained with great care. This wasn't just reverence for myth. It was a recognition that standing water needed maintenance to remain clean. Priests skimmed the surface, replaced portions of the water, and kept the pools functioning. Over time, this systematic care became ritualized. What began as practical maintenance took on sacred meaning. The line between science and belief blurred. This blurring continued as people developed irrigation techniques. Canals, levees, and reservoirs required regular upkeep, measurements, and adjustments. Communities had to coordinate their efforts to ensure that water flowed properly. If a canal broke, entire fields could be lost. If a reservoir overflowed, it could destroy homes. Through trial and error, people learned how to calculate water flow, how to redirect currents, and how to store water during dry months. These tasks demanded precision and understanding, and yet they often described these processes in terms of divine guidance. Enki, the god who managed the deep, was credited with teaching humans how to manage water. Myths framed irrigation as knowledge the gods gifted rather than something humans developed through observation. but the myth captured the essence of what happened. Knowledge grew slowly, carefully, and through steady refinement. By placing this knowledge within a story about the deep, people ensured it would be passed down through generations. The scientific understanding of water expanded as civilizations grew. People began to notice the difference between seasonal rains and groundwater reserves. They recognized that marshlands required careful balance. They understood that salty soils needed treatment to remain fertile. They even developed early forms of water measurement using markers placed near riverbanks. These markers helped predict flooding patterns and prepare for agricultural cycles. The deep was no longer just a mythic presence, it was a field of knowledge that shaped daily life. Skeptics studying ancient texts sometimes argue that myths clouded scientific progress. But many scholars point out that the opposite is true. Myth often preserved information that might have otherwise been lost. Stories about the deep kept people focused on water as the foundation of life. Even if they didn't phrase it in scientific terms, their understanding was accurate. They recognized the importance of conservation, the need for maintenance, and the dangers of neglect. Modern hydrologists examining ancient irrigation systems frequently discover surprising sophistication. Some canals were engineered with gradients so precise that they rival modern construction. Wells were placed strategically according to geological features that ancient people understood through observation rather than instruments. Reservoirs were built to capture seasonal floods. Cities were positioned near optimal water sources. These decisions reflect knowledge that grew from experience passed down through mythic frameworks. The myth of Abzu helped shape this knowledge not by explaining mechanisms, but by preserving the idea of the deep as a constant force. The deep could be counted on. It didn't shift suddenly. It didn't disappear unless humans disrupted the system. This understanding encouraged long-term thinking. It encouraged care rather than exploitation. It encouraged people to treat water as a stable foundation rather than an unlimited resource. This mindset influenced legal systems as well. Some of the earliest laws in the world dealt with water, its distribution, its protection, and its theft. These laws weren't spiritual guidelines. They were practical responses to the realities of life in a water-dependent region. But the presence of water in legal codes reflected the same foundational understanding that shaped the myths. The deep mattered because survival depended on it. The connection between myth and science becomes even clearer when examining how ancient people describe the formation of the world. The idea that everything began with water aligns closely with modern theories about life's origins. Researchers now know that water is essential for the development of organic molecules, chemical reactions, and biological structures. Life emerges where water exists. Ancient people understood this intuitively. They didn't describe cellular processes or chemical bonds. They described the deep as the first environment. Their myths captured a truth that science later confirmed. Water came before life. This wasn't coincidence. It was observation shaped into narrative. People saw that everything living depended on water. They saw that water existed before cities, before fields, before animals appeared in their surroundings. They recognized that water flowed from unseen places older than the land they walked on. This understanding echoed into myth. Abzu wasn't just a god. He was a framework for understanding how the world began. Modern scientists studying ancient waters sometimes find themselves reflecting on these myths with renewed appreciation. They see that early civilizations accurately described the importance of groundwater. They recognize the sophistication in ancient canal systems. They note the long-term memory embedded in temple rituals. Whether or not the people believed Abzu literally slept beneath the world doesn't change the fact that their stories captured essential truths about how water behaves. As the narrative prepares to move into its final part, the connection between myth and memory becomes even clearer. The deep wasn't simply a mythic figure. It was a bridge between the earliest observations of nature and the stories humans used to preserve their understanding. It shaped how people viewed their world, how they managed their resources, and how they built their cities. And through these ancient waters, the memory of Abzu continued to flow, steady and quiet, carrying the earliest science hidden within the oldest stories. As the long arc of ancient history faded into later eras and civilizations rose and fell across the plains of Mesopotamia, the memory of Abzu never vanished. It shifted, softened, and took on different forms, but it remained present, quiet, consistent, and woven beneath the surface of the stories people told and the landscapes they lived upon. Even when new gods rose in importance, when empires replaced kingdoms, when writing styles changed, and when languages themselves transformed, the idea of the deep continued to linger. It wasn't a loud memory. It wasn't carried by ceremonies or inscriptions alone. It persisted because it was built into the structure of how people understood the world. The earliest storytellers had described a primordial ocean beneath creation. They imagined it as the first environment, the foundation from which all life emerged. For them, this wasn't a metaphor. It was the simplest, most direct explanation for a world shaped by water. Rivers nourished their fields. Wells sustained their communities. Marshes provided reeds, fish, and fertile ground. Lakes offered quiet places of reflection and resource. Water was everywhere, yet its ultimate source remained out of sight. The deep explained this mystery in a way that felt both practical and profound. As centuries passed, the idea of Abzu became more than a story about how the world began. It became a lens through which people viewed themselves. The deep represented stability in a world that changed constantly. It embodied memory, foundation, and the quiet presence beneath all living things. Even when people no longer described it in mythic terms, they continued to respond to water with the same instinctive respect their ancestors had shown. One of the most enduring aspects of Abzu's legacy lies in how people across different ages retained the understanding that water connects all life. In the ancient world, this connection was expressed through myth. In later eras, it took scientific form, but the underlying sense that something essential existed within water persisted. People noticed that wherever water flowed, life flourished. They noticed that when wells dried, community suffered. They observed that water carried memory, through rivers, through rainfall, through the cycles of seasons. Even as belief systems changed, this observation remained constant. The deep became an idea that could evolve without losing its meaning. To some, it represented the earliest state of creation. To others, it represented the hidden structures beneath the earth. To still others, it symbolized the persistence of older knowledge beneath newer forms of understanding. And as time continued its unbroken path, people across different cultures and periods continued to feel a quiet pull toward places where water gathered. That pull wasn't superstition. It reflected something deeply rooted in human experience. People feel calm beside rivers. They gather near lakes. They build cities around springs. They create rituals involving water even in belief systems unrelated to ancient Mesopotamian myth. This behavior suggests that the legacy of the deep isn't limited to the culture that named it. It's tied to something universal, the human awareness that water is foundational. Modern neuroscientists have studied how humans react to water, and the findings often mirror what ancient people expressed through stories. Water reduces stress. It stabilizes the mind. It creates a sense of safety and clarity. Even the sound of flowing water can soothe anxiety. Ancient people didn't describe these effects using scientific terminology. They described them through myth. Abzu, as the primordial deep, embodied this stabilizing force. His presence beneath the world allowed creation to hold together, and humans carried this understanding forward through instinct. This instinct influenced architecture long after the earliest temples were built. Civilizations around the world included water features in their sacred structures. Courtyards held fountains. Gardens built canals through their design. Bathhouses and ritual baths appeared in countless regions. The idea that water could cleanse, balance, restore, or connect people to something older than themselves remained long after the stories of Abzu fell out of common use. People didn't need the myth to behave in ways shaped by it. The behaviour itself had become natural. The legacy of Abzu also appears in language. Words for depth, foundation, ocean, and underworld often carry echoes of ancient ideas. In many cultures, words for origin and water overlap. Terms describing wisdom or memory often link to concepts of depth or submersion. These linguistic echoes aren't direct descendants of the word Abzu, but they reflect the same pattern of understanding, the recognition that depth carries meaning. Even in storytelling traditions far removed from Mesopotamia, the theme of primordial waters recurs. Modern interpretations often treat these similarities as evidence of shared human intuition rather than shared history. People from different cultures living near water-rich landscapes often came to similar conclusions about the nature of creation. They saw water as the first element, the first environment, and the necessary condition for life. The story of the deep may have taken different names across the world, but the underlying idea remained consistent. This shared understanding reinforces the idea that Abzu's legacy extends beyond myth. It represents the earliest human attempt to express a scientific truth through narrative form. Water came before life. Life depends on water, and the source of water lies beneath the surface, unseen yet essential. Ancient scribes captured this truth through the sleeping god of the deep. Modern scientists describe it through aquifers, hydrological cycles, and the chemistry of early Earth. The difference lies in language, not in meaning. This continuity of understanding across thousands of years reveals something else. People instinctively look for origins. They search for beginnings, for sources, for the conditions that allowed life to emerge. Abzu answered that question for ancient Mesopotamians. He provided the first explanation for creation that felt complete. And even when belief systems changed, the question remained. Later civilizations searched for their own origins. They developed new creation myths, new scientific theories, new philosophical frameworks. But the act of searching remained unchanged. The idea of a primordial deep continues to appear in modern scientific models of the early Earth. Researchers describe ancient oceans forming billions of years ago, shaping the conditions for early life. They describe hydrothermal vents beneath the ocean floor, providing energy and chemicals essential for the first biological reactions. They describe underground reservoirs that predate the oldest rivers. Without using the name Abzu, they describe the same foundation ancient people recognized. The deep-shaped life long before the surface world appeared. In this sense, the legacy of Abzu becomes part of a long intellectual tradition. People look beneath the surface for answers. They study what cannot be seen directly. They search for the structures that support existence. The deep becomes a metaphor not just for water but for inquiry. To understand the world, one must look beneath it. This idea appears in countless fields: geology, psychology, anthropology, astronomy. The surface rarely reveals the full truth. The foundation does. Even in everyday life, the presence of the deep is reflected in how people think and behave. People often describe their emotions or memories as running deep. They speak of deep waters when discussing uncertainty. They use depth as a way to express complexity. These expressions reflect an inherited understanding of what depth represents. It is the place where the unseen exists, where the important things lie, where history collects and settles. The oldest myths in the world continue to influence how people interpret their experiences. Abzu may not be invoked by name, but his legacy persists in the widespread sense that what lies beneath shapes everything above. This understanding appears in literature, in philosophy, in religion, in science, and in personal reflection. The deep remains a timeless idea because it expresses something true about how the world works and how humans perceive it. This perception also shapes how people imagine beginnings. When someone thinks about the origins of life, water usually appears in the picture. Oceans, lakes, rivers, All of them hold the possibility of life's earliest forms. Even fictional stories, whether set on Earth or distant planets, often begin with water. The instinct to place creation within the deep is older than written language. It was shaped long before the first clay tablets, long before the earliest scribes, long before the story of Abzu took its form. The universality of this instinct speaks to a broader legacy. Abzu was not simply a Mesopotamian idea. He was one expression of a human truth, that life feels connected to water in a way few other elements can match. People respond to rain with relief. They respond to drought with fear. They respond to oceans with a mixture of wonder and caution. Water shapes landscapes and societies, and it shapes the way people think about existence. As time continued and new civilizations rose, the memory of Abzu remained embedded within the broader cultural memory of the region. Early Jewish, Christian and Islamic texts reference primordial waters in their own ways. Greek philosophers describe the deep as the fundamental element of creation. Later societies interpreted the underworld as lying beneath waters either literal or symbolic. Each reinterpretation built upon the idea that the deep preceded everything. This long chain of understanding eventually intersected with modern scientific inquiry. Researchers searching for exoplanets look for signs of water as their first clue of potential life. Geological studies trace the movement of ancient groundwater beneath continents. Biologists explore underwater vents to understand how early life formed. The deep remains the starting point, even if its name has changed. In this way, Abzu's legacy reaches into the present, not as a mythological figure influencing belief, but as a conceptual framework that continues to shape the search for origins. The idea that something ancient and hidden supports life still drives scientific exploration. The concept that the earliest waters shaped everything remains foundational across disciplines. People today may not know the story of Abzu, but they still feel the pull of water. They visit lakes for calm. They sit beside rivers to think. They listen to rainfall for comfort. They travel to oceans for perspective. These instincts echo the understanding that life is tied to water in a fundamental way. The story of the deep remains written into the rhythms of human experience. Even the modern fascination with space exploration reflects this legacy. Scientists speak of oceans on distant moons, ancient seas on Mars, and planetary crusts hiding water beneath their surfaces. They describe worlds where deep oceans could exist without sunlight, shaped by internal heat rather than surface weather. The same curiosity that led ancient people to imagine a primordial ocean now drives researchers to search for water across the universe. What began as a story about the first god of the deep has grown into a global human tradition, a way of understanding origins that transcends time and culture. Abzu's legacy isn't limited to myth. It continues to appear in science, memory, instinct and imagination. The deep persists because it reflects a truth that remains as relevant now as it was thousands of years ago. And as the story draws closer to the quiet ending of this long journey through myth and memory, the deep still lies beneath it all, steady, silent, unchanged, waiting for whatever comes next in the unfolding world that grew above its ancient waters,